"You're mine tonight, darling." He whispered it like a warning, and every woman before her had taken it as one. But Caroline Miller didn't flinch. She didn't grab her coat. She didn't reach for the door. She looked Jacob Thompson straight in the eye, and she stayed. If you've ever been told you're not worth fighting for, then this story is for you. Subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and watch until the end. You'll be surprised. The stagecoach dropped Caroline Miller at the edge of Harlan Creek, just as the sky turned the color of old bone, pale and hollow, and threatening everything at once. She had one suitcase, $14 sewn into the lining of her coat, and a folded letter from a man named Jacob Thompson, who had placed an advertisement in the Helena Gazette 3 weeks prior, seeking a household manager for a working cattle ranch. The pay was modest. The hours were described as long. The accommodations were described as adequate. What the advertisement had not described, what no advertisement ever could, was the weight of the silence that settled over the town the moment she stepped off that coach. 3 men sitting outside the general store went quiet mid-sentence. A woman hanging laundry across the road stopped with a sheet half raised and stared. Even the horse tied to the post in front of the barber shop seemed to turn its head. Caroline was 29 years old, dark-haired, travel-worn, and carrying herself with the kind of careful posture that women develop when they've learned that how you hold your spine determines whether the world takes a swing at you or steps aside. She'd come from Billings, before that from St. Louis, before that from a life she'd spent the better part of 2 years trying to put enough distance between herself and the memory of it. She wasn't running anymore. She'd made herself that promise on the last night in Billings, sitting on the edge of a narrow bed in a boarding house that smelled of mildew and other people's regrets. No more running. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward the main street. It was the woman outside the dry goods store who spoke first, a stout, sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, with flour on her apron, and an expression that suggested she'd seen trouble coming in many forms, and had categorized this one quickly. "You'd be the one answering Jacob Thompson's advertisement." It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am. Caroline Miller." The woman looked her over the way you'd look at a horse you weren't sure about buying. Not unkind exactly, just honest. "How long have you been traveling?" 3 days. "And before that you were in Billings?" "I was." "You know anything about cattle ranching?" "I know bookkeeping, organization, how to manage a household and keep accounts in order." Mr. Thompson's advertisement specified. "I know what his advertisement specified." The woman pulled the apron tighter around her waist. "I'm Ruth Hadley. My husband owns the feed store. I've lived in Harlan Creek going on 22 years, and I've watched 3 women come through that same advertisement in the last 4 years. She paused. Not one of them lasted past the 2nd week. Caroline kept her expression level. "What happened to them?" "Nothing dramatic, nothing violent, if that's what you're wondering." Ruth Hadley folded her arms. "Jacob Thompson is not a cruel man. He is, however, a man who has decided that being alone is easier than being with people, and he has spent considerable energy making sure that everyone around him agrees with that conclusion." Another pause. "You understand what I'm telling you?" "I think so." "Good." Ruth glanced down at the suitcase. "You need someone to drive you out to the Diamond T?" "I can walk if you point me the right direction." Ruth Hadley looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in the older woman's expression, not quite respect, but the beginning of a consideration that might become respect given enough time. "It's 6 miles, and that sky," she tilted her chin upward, "is going to open up inside the hour. Come on. My husband's making a delivery out that direction this afternoon. He'll take you." The wagon ride took 40 minutes on a rutted road that seemed designed to discourage visitors. Earl Hadley was a quiet man who offered 4 complete sentences during the entire journey, 3 of which were directions, and 1 of which was a quiet observation that the creek running alongside the road had been running low for going on 6 weeks, and that some of the ranchers were starting to get nervous about it. Caroline filed that away. Water was always where the trouble started in cattle country. She'd learned that in Billings. The Diamond T Ranch announced itself through its fence line, first 4 miles of it, running along the road, solid post and wire maintained, with the kind of meticulous care that told you the man inside either had excellent hired hands or held himself to a standard he'd never compromise on. Probably both. Then the main gate with the brand burned into the crossbeam. Then the long drive leading to a house that was larger than she'd expected. 2 stories well built, the kind of house that had been constructed with intention rather than assembled out of necessity. Someone had once meant for that house to be full of people. It didn't look full of people now. Earl Hadley pulled the wagon to a stop and waited just long enough for her to climb down and collect her suitcase before giving the horse a soft click of his tongue and rolling on toward the barn where a hired hand was already walking out to meet him. Caroline stood in front of the porch steps. A dog appeared from somewhere around the side of the house, a big gray-muzzled cattle dog, who examined her with calm authority, decided she was acceptable, and sat down. She took that as a reasonable endorsement. She knocked. Nothing. She knocked again harder. The door opened so abruptly that she took a half-step back without meaning to. Jacob Thompson was not what she'd expected. She wasn't entirely sure what she'd expected. The advertisement, the whispers from Ruth Hadley, the silences from the men outside the general store had built a picture in her mind of someone imposing, but perhaps soft at the edges. A difficult man who'd grown difficult through a kind of sad neglect, like a garden nobody had tended. Jacob Thompson was not soft at the edges. He was tall. A full head taller than her, with the kind of physical presence that came from decades of actual physical work, rather than the performed broadness of men who wanted to appear powerful. His hands visible at his sides were the hands of someone who'd mended fence and pulled calves and done every other hard thing a ranch demanded. His face was weathered in the way that Montana weather weathered things, not gently. He was somewhere in his late 30s, she guessed, maybe 40. Hard to tell with men who'd spent that much time outdoors. He looked at her the way you'd look at something that had arrived at your door that you hadn't ordered. Caroline Miller. Yes. You're early. The stagecoach was on time. I apologize if... I don't need an apology. I need to know if you can actually do the job or if you exaggerated your qualifications in the letter. Caroline set her suitcase down on the porch. Not in a way that was dramatic. Just in a way that said she intended to be standing here for more than 30 seconds, and her arm was tired. I didn't exaggerate. The last woman who took this position told me she had 5 years of account management experience. He leaned against the doorframe in a way that was either casual or deliberately designed to fill the entire frame, she couldn't tell which. She meant she'd managed her husband's general store accounts for 5 years, which isn't the same thing. I can show you references. I worked for 3 years as a bookkeeper for a freight company in St. Louis. Before that, 2 years managing the household accounts for a family in Kansas City. I can show you the letters. You don't need to show me anything tonight. He straightened up and stepped back from the door. Come in. I'll show you where you'll sleep. We can go over the accounts tomorrow. She picked up her suitcase and walked inside. The inside of the house was, she searched for the right word, functional. Every piece of furniture served a purpose. Every surface was clear of anything unnecessary. There were no pictures on the walls in the front room, which struck her immediately because most households of this size and this evident prosperity had pictures on the walls. Framed things. Evidence of connections to other people, to other places, to a life beyond the immediate practicality of survival. There was none of that here. There was a fireplace with a good stack of wood beside it. A table with 4 chairs, though only one showed the wear of regular use. A desk in the corner with papers and ledger books stacked in the kind of organized pile that suggested either a methodical mind or someone who'd recently tried to make things look more organized than they actually were. She glanced at the ledgers. She'd look at those properly in the morning. Jacob Thompson was already at the stairs. Your room is up here. There's water in the pitcher. Dinner is at 6. I eat at 6. The hands eat in the bunkhouse. You'll take your meals in the house. He said this with his back to her, climbing the stairs. The kitchen is yours to manage starting tomorrow. There are supplies. If you need something specific, make a list, and I'll send someone to town. Thank you. He paused on the stairs. Didn't turn around. Mrs. Hadley talked to you. Caroline kept her voice even. She mentioned you'd had other women in this position. What else did she say? That you were a man who'd decided being alone was easier than being with people. A silence. Then, she's not wrong. He continued up the stairs. The room he showed her was small but clean, genuinely clean, not just swept it clean. The bed was made with military precision. The window looked out toward the east pasture. "It's a good room," she said, and she meant it. He stood in the doorway. "Dinner at 6." And he was gone. And she was not leaving. She was exactly where she needed to be, and the 3 days she'd promised Jacob Thompson were about to reveal something that went far deeper than a dismissed bookkeeper skimming supply payments. She found the 7th entry on the second morning. It was buried inside a quarterly grazing fee record, the kind of line item that a busy man reviewing his own books would skim past without stopping, because grazing fees were a routine cost, and routine costs didn't trigger alarm. But the amount was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Just wrong enough that it would shift the quarterly total by $32 in a direction that made the ranch's operating margin look narrower than it actually was. $32 wasn't much. But $32, repeated across enough line items, across enough months, started to build a picture. A particular picture. The picture of a ranch that was barely holding on. Caroline sat back in the chair and looked at what she'd assembled across the desk. 7 pages of notes now, cross-referenced and dated with every falsified entry marked in red pencil and every original receipt it contradicted stacked in order beside it. She'd found the receipts in a wooden box in the bottom of the desk that Jacob had clearly forgotten existed, or had stopped looking in, or had avoided looking in, because the gap between what the receipt said and what the ledger said had become a territory he didn't know how to enter anymore. She understood that. She understood the particular exhaustion of a problem that had grown past the point where you could hold all of it in your head at once, so you stopped looking directly at it, and instead looked around it and kept moving and hoped the moving was enough. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. But she wasn't going to tell him that yet. Not until she had everything. Donnie knocked on the front room doorway at noon with a plate of food that Jacob had apparently sent from the kitchen. He cooked. She looked at the plate salt pork again, but this time with fried potatoes and something that looked like it had started life as a biscuit and had emerged from the oven with considerable character. He cooks when something's bothering him. Donnie set the plate on the edge of the desk with the careful respect of someone depositing something important. It's how you know. He goes quiet and he goes to the kitchen, and an hour later there's food. Does he do that often? Often enough. Donnie looked at the spread of papers on the desk with wide eyes. You found more? A few more things. Is it bad? She considered how to answer that. It's clarifying. Donnie absorbed this. Mr. Thompson's been since you showed him those first entries yesterday. He's been out in the north pasture since first light. Just working. Not talking to anybody. He paused. That's different from his regular not talking to anybody. Regular not talking to anybody is just how he is. This is. He searched for the word. This is the kind of not talking that means something's got under his skin and he's trying to outwork it. He'll need to sit still long enough to look at what I've found. Yes, ma'am. Donnie shifted his weight from foot to foot. For what it's worth, he talked about you this morning. She looked up. What did he say? The young man went slightly red. He said, and I'm quoting exactly, she knows what she's doing. He paused. For Jacob Thompson, that's practically a speech. She looked back at her papers. Tell him I'll need him after supper. Jacob came in at 6, 8 standing at the kitchen counter. She noticed he'd stopped eating at the table since that first night, and wasn't sure whether to read anything into it, and came to the front room doorway at 10 past the hour, with his arms crossed and his expression set in the particular way of a man preparing himself to receive bad news. Show me. She laid it out for him methodically. Every falsified entry, every corresponding receipt. The pattern of the falsification, not random, not opportunistic, but deliberate and architectural designed to construct a specific narrative about the financial health of the Diamond T over a period of 7 months. Jacob stood on the other side of the desk and didn't speak until she'd finished. He knew what he was looking for, Jacob said finally. Greer, when I hired him. It looks that way. Caldwell sent him. That's the most logical conclusion, yes. His jaw was tight. She watched him work through it, the particular process of a man absorbing not just the fact of a betrayal, but its architecture, its patience, the way it had been constructed around him while he was working 18-hour days trying to keep his operation running. I trusted him with my books for 5 months. Yes. And the whole time. She kept her voice steady. Not soft, that would have been wrong, would have been a kind of condescension. Just steady. But here's what else I can tell you. She pulled the top page of her notes toward him. Every falsified entry has a corresponding receipt that contradicts it. Every one. Greer was careful about the numbers, but he couldn't falsify the physical records without removing them, and he didn't remove them. He probably didn't know about the box in the bottom drawer. Or he thought you'd never look. I didn't look. You didn't have reason to look. You trusted the man you'd hired. She tapped the page. But the evidence of the actual financial state of this ranch is right here. Your operation isn't failing, Mr. Thompson. Your records were made to look like it was. Those are very different things. He stared at the page. Then he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. It was the first time she'd seen him sit anywhere in the house, except at the dinner table. And even there he sat, the way men sat when they were ready to stand up again at a moment's notice. Now he sat like a man whose legs had made a decision independent of his intentions. Caldwell's going to come back. Almost certainly. Soon. Possibly. If he's been watching the ranch's apparent financial position, and he thinks the picture is bad enough, yes, probably soon. And when he does, he's going to come with numbers. He always comes with numbers. Both times before he had figures, ranch valuations debt estimates that he presented like they were facts. He looked at her across the desk. I didn't have anything to counter with because I didn't actually know what my own book said. You will now. He looked at her for a moment. Then, who taught you to do this? A man named Gerald Pratt, in St. Louis. He ran a freight operation, 12 wagons, 2 warehouses contracts with 4 different rail lines. And he kept his books the way a surgeon keeps instruments. Everything in its place, everything clean, everything accounted for. She straightened her notes. He said the man who knows his numbers owns the room, every room. He sounds like someone worth knowing. How was? She paused. He died 2 years ago. His wife sold the operation to the rail company. I moved on. Jacob Thompson looked at her for a moment with an expression she was learning to read that particular quality of attention he gave to information that was landing somewhere deeper than the surface. Is that why you came to Billings? Partly. And then here. And then here. He nodded slowly, not pressing. She noticed that about him, he asked questions, received answers, and stopped. He didn't push past what was offered. Whether that was respect or disinterest, she hadn't yet determined. She was beginning to think it was respect. The documentation, he said. If I need to use it if Caldwell comes, is it solid enough to hold up? If I have one more day, yes. You'll have it. He stood. I'll pull the supply receipt boxes from the barn storeroom tonight. There are 2 more years of records out there that might... He stopped. Started again. If Greer was only here from October to March, he could only reach what was in the house. But if Caldwell has other people looking, if there's anything in the older records that could be used against this ranch, then we should know about it before he does. Yes. He looked at her steadily. Yes, exactly. They regarded each other across the spread of papers. The lamp between them threw warm light across the documented evidence of a fraud they'd uncovered together. And there was something in that, in the shared weight of it, the shared understanding of what it meant and what it was going to require that felt different from any professional arrangement she'd been party to before. Not personal. Not yet. But the beginning of something that was honest. And honesty, she'd learned, was rarer and more valuable than most people admitted. Mr. Thompson? Jacob. She looked up. You've been here 3 days, he said. I think you can call me Jacob. She considered this for a moment. All right, Jacob. She gathered her notes into a neat stack. Get the receipt boxes. I'll start on them in the morning. He left 3 boxes outside the front room door before she came downstairs the next morning. She found them there like a kind of offering, 2 wooden crates and a tin box, each crammed with the physical evidence of 2 years of a working ranch's financial life. Receipts, invoices, payment records, supply orders, payroll sheets. All of it bundled in the rough, approximate way of a busy man who'd kept the records because he knew he should, but hadn't had time to keep them well. She made coffee and started on the first box. By mid-morning, she'd found something she hadn't been looking for. It wasn't a falsified entry. It wasn't evidence of fraud. It was a lien notice, dated 18 months ago, filed against 50 acres of the Diamond T's eastern boundary, a section that abutted the creek. The lien was filed by a company called Mountain Standard Holdings, which she didn't recognize for a debt that the notice described only as outstanding obligations per agreement dated March 1884. She sat with it for a long time. Then she went to find Jacob, who was in the corral with 2 of the hands working a young horse that was still making up its mind about whether it wanted to be worked. She waited at the fence until there was a natural pause, then held up the lien notice. He saw her expression and came to the fence immediately. He read the document without a word. She watched his face go through several somethings in rapid succession, each one controlled before the next one arrived. "Where did you find this?" "Second receipt box, bundled inside a payroll sheet from the same month." "I've never seen this." "You're sure?" "I'm certain." His voice was flat and hard. "I would remember. A lien on my land, I would remember." "Could someone have bundled it in the payroll sheet on purpose? Someone who didn't want you to find it?" His hands had tightened on the fence rail. "Greer didn't start until October. This is dated March, 7 months before Greer started." She kept her voice level. "Which means either this was filed legitimately and someone intercepted your copy before it reached you, or it was filed fraudulently and whoever filed it made sure I wouldn't see it until they needed me to." He stared at the document. "Mountain Standard Holdings. Do you know it?" "No. I've been going through your older records. I don't see any agreement from March 1884 that involves that company or anything like that name." "Because there isn't one." He pushed back from the fence and handed the notice back to her. "Someone filed a lien on my land against an agreement that doesn't exist." The morning was very quiet for a moment. Even the young horse had stopped its argument. "Jacob." She folded the notice carefully. "Is there a land registry in Harlan Creek, or do you need to go to the county seat?" He was already looking toward the barn. "County seat is Mill Haven, 20 miles north. Someone needs to go look at what's on file for that lien, whether it's registered, what it says on the original filing. Because if it is on file, then Caldwell can use it." He turned back to her. His face was very still now, the way faces go still when a man is working very hard, not to let what he's feeling show. Because what he's feeling is the particular cold rage of someone who has realized that the ground beneath them has been quietly dug away while they were looking elsewhere. He comes to me with a purchase offer. My books show a failing operation. There's a lien on my eastern boundary, the boundary that runs along the creek. The creek water rights are the most valuable thing on this property. Without them..." He stopped. "Without them, the ranch isn't viable long-term." "No." One word, flat as stone. "It's not." She looked at him. He was looking out past the corral fence at the eastern boundary of his land, at the line of fence posts, and the creek glinting beyond them, and the sky above it all, and his expression was that of a man looking at something he'd built with his hands and his years, and was only now understanding how long someone had been working to take it from him. "I'll go to Mill Haven." He looked at her. "No. I know what to look for in a land registry. I know how to read a filing. I know what a fraudulent lien looks like versus a legitimate one, because Gerald Pratt went through exactly this with a freight contract dispute in 1879, and I sat across the table while his lawyer. "I'm not sending you alone to the county seat to look at legal filings." "Then come with me." A pause. "I can't leave the ranch right now, not with everything." "Donnie can manage for one day. He's more capable than you give him credit for." She met his eyes steadily. "Jacob, if that lien is on file, You need to know what it says before Caldwell uses it. Every day we don't know is a day he has an advantage we don't have." The silence stretched. Then something she hadn't seen yet. Jacob Thompson looked away first. "Tomorrow morning. Early. I'll be ready." She turned and walked back toward the house. Behind her, she heard Donnie's voice from somewhere near the barn. Did she just talk him into going to Mill Haven? She didn't hear what the other hand said back, but she heard Donnie's low whistle, and she permitted herself a very small private smile that she kept carefully turned away from everyone. They left for Mill Haven at first light in the buckboard, the dog watching from the porch with an expression of mild philosophical reproach at being left behind. Jacob drove. Caroline sat beside him with her notebook and the lien notice, and a list of specific questions she'd drafted the night before while she was supposed to be sleeping. For the first several miles, neither of them spoke. Then, "How did you know about the water rights?" She glanced at him. "I told you, I look at things. The creek is your eastern boundary, and it's the water source for your south and east pastures. Any lien on that boundary land is functionally a lien on your water access. It's not complicated. It's just the kind of thing that becomes obvious when you're reading your records carefully. I should have seen it. You were running a cattle operation alone. You can't see everything." "I should have." "Jacob." She said it firmly, but without edge. "A man who builds a thing and runs a thing and makes a thing work every day is not the same man who can step back and see what someone patient and systematic is doing to undermine it from the outside. That's not a personal failing. That's just one man with one set of eyes." He was quiet. "You saw enough to let Greer go in March," she went on. "You saw enough to know something was wrong even when you couldn't prove it. Your instincts were right. The documentation just wasn't there yet. It's there now. It's there now." He was quiet again for a while. Then, "In Billings, what were you doing before you came here?" She considered the question, not the factual answer which she'd given him, but the question underneath it, which was a different thing. "Waiting," she said finally. "For what?" "For the right situation to walk toward rather than away from." She looked out at the road ahead. "I spent a couple of years doing things that were available, safe, that I was capable of, but that didn't require anything particular of me. It was—" She stopped. "It was a way of living that I'd outgrown and hadn't admitted it yet." He said nothing. But his hands on the reins shifted slightly, and she had the sense he was listening in the particular careful way he listened not just to the words, but to the space around them. "The advertisement," he said finally. "Yes." That was the right situation. She looked at him. He was watching the road. His profile was, she noticed this without particularly intending, to the profile of a man who had been handsome in a young man's easy way and had become something more interesting than handsome with time. The kind of face that had been shaped by exactly the life it had lived. "It appears so," she said. He didn't respond. But the line of his shoulders changed very slightly. Not much the way something changes when a small weight that's been resting on it is quietly removed. The county land registry was managed by a clerk named Albert Foss, who had the faintly oppressed air of a man who had not chosen his vocation so much as arrived at it through a series of small decisions that had each seemed reasonable at the time. He recognized Jacob, the slight wariness that moved through his expression. Said so. And he looked at Caroline with the particular blankness of a man who had not expected a woman in his registry office on a Tuesday morning and was taking a moment to resort the situation. "We need to see the filings for Mountain Standard Holdings," Caroline said. "Specifically, a lien filed against the Diamond T Ranch eastern boundary parcel dated approximately 18 months ago." Albert Foss blinked. "You'd need this property record for—" "I have the lien notice." She put it on the counter. "This was received by the property owner. We need to see the original filing." He looked at Jacob. Jacob said nothing, which Caroline had already understood was his preferred mode of communication in situations where the alternative was saying something he would rather not. Albert Foss went to his files. He came back 4 minutes later with an expression that was difficult to read, somewhere between administrative distress and genuine unease. "I have a Mountain Standard Holdings filing here. Property lien Diamond T Eastern Boundary. He set a document on the counter. But what? The signature on the original filing. He turned the document to face her. That's not a Millhaven signature. That's filed on behalf of the property owner. She looked at the signature line. Then she looked at it again. Beside her, she felt Jacob go very still. The signature on the lien document. The signature of the supposed property owner, acknowledging the lien against his own land, was not Jacob Thompson's. It was a forgery. A confident one, not without skill, but a forgery. She could see it in the pressure of the pen strokes. Too uniform, too careful. The strokes of a man copying a signature he'd studied, rather than the loose authority of a man writing his own name. "This was never signed by you," she said. "No." Jacob's voice was quiet. "It was not." "Mr. Foss." She kept her eyes on the document. "When a lien is filed against a property in this registry, does the original property owner have to appear in person to acknowledge it, or it can be filed by a representative with appropriate documentation of authorization?" And what documentation was filed here as authorization? Albert Foss looked through his folder. His expression grew incrementally more troubled with each piece of paper he examined. "There's a letter of authorization here, signed by..." He turned it over. "Signed by Jacob Thompson, authorizing a representative of Mountain Standard Holdings to act on his behalf regarding the eastern parcel. May I see it?" He turned it toward her. The signature was from the same hand that had signed the lien. The same confident forgery. Applied twice, once to an authorization letter that didn't exist, once to a lien document that should never have been filed. "This signature is not mine." Jacob picked up the authorization letter, held it, set it back down. His voice was absolutely level. "I have never communicated in writing with Mountain Standard Holdings. I have never authorized any representative to act on my behalf regarding any parcel of my land. I have never heard of this company before 4 days ago." Albert Foss looked at the papers on the counter, looked at Jacob, looked at Caroline. "Mr. Thompson," he said carefully, "this is a significant..." "Yes." Jacob's jaw was tight. "It is." Caroline put her hand flat on the counter beside the documents. "Mr. Foss, I need you to confirm for me in writing today, before we leave this office, that the Diamond T Eastern Boundary lien was filed without the property owner's direct acknowledgement, that the authorization documentation appears inconsistent in its provenance, and that the registry is prepared to note those facts in the property record pending a formal legal challenge." She held his gaze. "Can you do that?" Albert Foss looked at her for a long moment. He was not a brave man, she could see that clearly. He was a careful man, which was not the same thing, but could sometimes produce similar results if you gave it the right context. "I can make a note in the record," he said finally. "I can't make a ruling. That would need... A note in the record is enough for now." She kept her voice steady. "We appreciate your cooperation." He made the note. It took him 10 minutes and 3 different consultations with a manual on the corner of his desk, and his handwriting grew increasingly small and cautious as he wrote, but he made it. He dated it. He initialed it. When they walked back out onto the street, Jacob stopped on the boardwalk and stood there for a moment without speaking. She waited. "He forged my signature," he said finally. "Yes, on a document filed in a public registry, with a fabricated authorization letter. Yes. That's..." He stopped. "Fraud." She said it directly because he needed to hear the word, and she was not going to soften it. Criminal fraud, Jacob. Not just sharp dealing. Not just a difficult business negotiation. This is a man who forged your name on legal documents to create a claim against your property. He turned and looked at her. Something in his face had gone past anger into a territory that was colder and more considered than anger. The expression of a man who has taken the full measure of what's been done to him and is now deciding very deliberately what he intends to do about it. "Is the documentation we have what you've compiled? Is it enough?" "With what we got from Foss today? Yes, I believe it is." "Enough to bring to a lawyer. Enough to bring to a lawyer and expect him to tell you it's solid." He nodded. Once. Decisive. "There's a lawyer in Millhaven," he said. "Henderson. He handled my father's estate. He was already moving down the boardwalk. He's good. She fell into step beside him. I know you want to do this today. Don't you? She glanced at him. Yes. He almost, not quite, but almost smiled. It was a brief thing gone before it fully arrived, but it was the first time she'd seen anything close to it on his face, and it landed with a kind of quiet force she hadn't anticipated. Come on then. Henderson's office was at the far end of the main street, a modest office above a dry goods store accessible by a narrow staircase that smelled of sawdust and old paper. Henderson himself was a compact, gray-haired man in his 60s who received Jacob's appearance with quiet surprise, and Caroline's with the more prolonged adjustment of a man reconfiguring his understanding of a situation. He read the documentation in silence. Every page. The falsified ledger entries. The lien notice. The Millhaven registry document with Albert Foss's note. The authorization letter with the forged signature. When he finished, he set the papers down and folded his hands on top of them and looked at Jacob over his spectacles. Jacob, this is a serious matter. I'm aware. Whoever orchestrated this went to considerable trouble. The forgery is skilled. The filing was done through proper channels. The misdirection in your books was systematic. He looked down at the papers. This was planned. Yes. Do you have a name? I have a name I believe is responsible. I don't have direct evidence connecting that name to these specific actions. Henderson looked at him. Caldwell. The word sat there in the small office. You know him, Caroline said. I know of him. Henderson removed his spectacles and polished them with careful deliberation, which she recognized as the gesture of a man thinking, rather than a man actually polishing his spectacles. There have been questions, in this county and in 2 adjacent counties, about the circumstances under which certain ranches have changed hands in the last 3 years. Questions that were raised and then quietly dropped. He put his spectacles back on. I will tell you honestly, whoever we take this matter to will need to be someone with both the jurisdiction and the will to pursue it. Caldwell has relationships in this territory. What kind of relationships? Caroline kept her voice even. Political ones. Henderson looked at the kind that make people careful. Jacob leaned forward. Are you telling me there's nothing to be done? I am telling you, Henderson said carefully, that what can be done must be done carefully and correctly, with documentation that is so clean and so comprehensive that it cannot be questioned or set aside. He looked at the papers in front of him. This. He tapped the stack. This is a very good start. I need time to review it fully. I need Jacob's sworn statement regarding the forged signature. And I will need... He looked at Caroline. May I ask who compiled this analysis? I did. And your name is Caroline Miller. I am the household manager at the Diamond Tea. Henderson regarded her for a moment, with an expression she was learning to recognize the particular recalibration of a man encountering competence in a form he hadn't expected. Miss Miller. He set his spectacles straight. The ledger analysis it's very thorough. Where did you train? Experience, Mr. Henderson, and a very good teacher. He nodded slowly. I'll need you to sign a statement attesting to the accuracy of the analysis and your findings, as a witness to the discovery of the lien notice and the subsequent registry visit. Of course. They were there for 2 more hours. Statements were drafted and signed. Henderson asked questions she had answers for, and Jacob had answers for, and together their answers built something solid in the room, layered and documented and clean. When they finally left the office and came back down the narrow staircase into the afternoon light, Jacob stopped on the boardwalk and ran a hand across the back of his neck and exhaled. That was... He stopped. Yes. You knew what he was going to need before he asked for it. Most of it. You'd prepared for this. She looked at him. I prepare for most things. He looked at her for a moment in that steady way he had. The watching that she'd learned wasn't coldness, but attention. A particular quality of attention that most people didn't take the time to develop because it required you to be still, and stillness was something that had to be practiced. Caroline. He said it differently than he had before. Not the formal address of an employer to an employee. Not the careful neutrality of a man managing his own distance from people. Something else. Something that had less armor around it. I owe you, I can't. He stopped again. She waited. Thank you, he said finally. Simple, direct. The words of a man who didn't use words casually. She nodded. You would have found it eventually. I wouldn't have, not in time. He held her gaze. You know that. She didn't argue with it. Because he was right, and they both knew it, and there was something in the honesty of that, in his willingness to say it plainly, rather than take cover behind a qualified version of it that felt like a door opening. Not wide, not all the way, but open. We should start back. It'll be dark in 4 hours. He nodded. They walked back to the buckboard in the clear afternoon light, and the drive back to Harlan Creek was different from the drive out. Not easier exactly, because the weight of what they'd found and what it meant was real and serious. But different. The silence between them had changed its quality again, the way it had been changing in small increments since that first night in the barn. It was becoming, she thought, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. They were 3 miles from the ranch when Jacob spoke. Caldwell will move soon. He was looking at the road ahead, both hands steady on the reins. He's been patient for 7 months, but if his people are watching the property, if they've seen any indication that someone's been going through the books, then he'll want to make his approach before we can prepare. Yes. So we need to be ready before he arrives. Henderson will need at least 2 weeks to. I'm not talking about Henderson. She turned to look at him directly. I'm talking about you. When Caldwell comes to your door, and he will come to your door, not to a lawyer's office, not to a registry. He will come to your property, and he will stand in front of you, and he will present his offer, and his numbers, and his version of your situation. And everything he presents will be designed to make you feel like you're standing in a hole that only he can pull you out of. She held his gaze. When that happens, you cannot react the way you want to react. A pause. How do I want to react? The way your hands were on that fence rail yesterday morning. His jaw tightened. I know. She kept her voice steady. I know that's not a fair thing to ask, but Caldwell is expecting you to react with anger. He's expecting you to be alone and defensive and without clear documentation of your actual position. He's counting on all 3 of those things. She paused. He's going to be wrong about all 3. Jacob was quiet for a long moment. The ranch came into view ahead. The fence line first, then the gate, then the long drive and the house and the barn and all of it. The whole thing he'd built and his father had begun before him, and that someone patient and calculating had been trying to take apart piece by piece for 7 months. All right, he said quietly. When he comes, you're there. She looked at him. I'm not asking because I need someone to... He stopped, tried again. I'm asking because you know the documentation better than I do, and because you have a way of seeing things clearly when... He stopped again. When I might not. She looked at his profile in the late afternoon light. I'll be there. He nodded. They drove through the gate. Donnie was waiting at the barn, with the slightly too casual posture of someone who had been watching for the buckboard for the last hour and was now pretending he hadn't been. How'd it go? He reached up for the harness. Jacob stepped down from the buckboard. He looked at Donnie, then back at the house, then out toward the eastern boundary and the creek beyond it, just visible in the late light. It went well. Donnie looked at Caroline as she climbed down. She gave him a small nod. His face broke into a grin he immediately tried to suppress and mostly failed to. Jacob walked toward the barn, then stopped, turned. Caroline. She looked up. Dinner tonight, at the table. A pause. Both of us. She held his gaze for a moment. 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock. He went into the barn. Donnie waited approximately 4 seconds before turning to her with an expression of barely contained amazement. He just... Don't, she said, but not unkindly. He closed his mouth, opened it again. Yes, ma'am. She walked toward the house. Behind her, she could hear him very quietly whistling. Caroline sat on the edge of the bed and listened to his footsteps go back down the stairs across the floor below and out through what she guessed was the back door toward the barn. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she unpacked her suitcase. Dinner at 6 was exactly that. 6 o'clock, a meal on the table, and Jacob Thompson already seated when she came downstairs. He'd apparently cooked it himself. Salt pork, boiled potatoes, cornbread. That was better than it had any right to be, given that it came from a man who clearly treated cooking as an obstacle to be cleared rather than an activity to be enjoyed. They ate in silence for approximately 4 minutes. The creek. He looked up. Mr. Hadley mentioned it's been running low. 6 weeks. Jacob set down his fork. Not in an irritated way. More like a man recalibrating to an unexpected development in his environment. That's right. How many head are you running on the south pasture? A pause. 340. And your water access there, that's all from the creek. There's a secondary well sunk about a mile in. It's been keeping up. So far? He looked at her steadily. So far. I saw figures in your ledger stack. I wasn't going through them. I just caught a glimpse when I walked past that looked like they might be irrigation costs. Have you looked at expanding the secondary well or routing additional? I have a man who handles the water management. Does he know it's been 6 weeks? The silence that followed was about 4 seconds long. In another man, it might have been the silence before anger. In Jacob Thompson, she had the sense it was something else, the silence of a man genuinely recalibrating. He's aware, Jacob said finally. We've been watching it. All right. She returned to her food. Another silence. Then, you looked at my ledgers in the 30 seconds you were in the front room. I noticed them. I didn't look at them. There's a difference. What did you notice? That your most recent column is running about 2 months behind on entries. That whatever you paid out in August either wasn't recorded or was recorded somewhere I didn't see. And that you've got at least 3 different hands writing in that book, which usually means your records aren't going to reconcile cleanly when you need them to. Jacob Thompson looked at her for a long moment. It's a mess. I've seen worse. When can you start? Tomorrow morning. He nodded, picked up his fork. They finished dinner in silence, but it was a different silence than the one they'd started with. This one had texture to it. Wait. She was washing the dishes when he spoke from behind her. The last woman who held this position lasted 11 days. Mrs. Hadley told me none of them lasted past the 2nd week. She was being generous. He set his coffee cup on the counter beside the basin. The one before that lasted 6 days. The one before that made it to 3 weeks, but she spent the last week of those 3 weeks avoiding me entirely and writing letters home. Caroline kept washing. Why are you telling me this? Because I'd rather you know it now than be surprised by it later. Surprised by what exactly? A pause. By me. She turned around and looked at him directly. He was leaning against the counter, same posture as the doorframe. Earlier, the posture of a man who'd learned to occupy space in ways that kept other people from crowding him. Mr. Thompson, I came from Billings because I needed work, and this was the work that was offered. I am not here because I think ranching in Montana is going to be charming, or because I have some romantic notion about the frontier. I'm here because I'm good at what I do, and I needed a place to do it. She picked up the next dish. I don't require you to be easy. I require you to be honest about what needs doing. Can you do that? He studied her for a moment. Yes. Then I expect we'll be fine. She turned back to the dishes. He stood there for another few seconds. She could feel it, the weight of his presence in the room. The slight surprise of a man who'd spent years being the most immovable thing in any given situation and had just encountered something that didn't move either. Then he went upstairs. The dog appeared in the kitchen doorway, watched her finish the dishes with an expression of philosophical approval, and then disappeared again. Char. The storm came at 2 in the morning. Caroline had been asleep for perhaps 3 hours when the first crack of thunder rattled the window glass, hard enough that she sat up with her heart already running fast, the way it does when the sound catches you before the waking does. She got to the window in time to see a flash of lightning illuminate the entire eastern pasture in a second of white clarity. The cattle were moving. Even from here, even through the glass and the dark, and the first heavy sheets of rain that were beginning to lash the side of the house. She could see the herd beginning to shift that particular restless pressing movement that meant they were spooked and starting to push toward whatever boundary they could reach. She was dressed and downstairs in under 2 minutes. Jacob Thompson was already at the back door pulling on his coat, 2 of his hired hands behind him. He turned when he heard her on the stairs. His expression in the lamplight was surprise that he converted very quickly into something else. "Stay in the house. The south fence, if they hit the south fence at that volume. I know the south fence. Stay in the house. The gate at the east corner of the south pasture." She crossed the kitchen toward him. "I saw it this afternoon when Mr. Hadley drove me in. The hinge on the top rail is loose. I noticed it specifically because—" "How loose?" "Loose enough that if 300 pounds of frightened cattle pushes against it, you're not going to have a gate anymore. You're going to have a gap, and then you're going to have cattle on the county road in the middle of a lightning storm." Jacob stared at her. "Pete." He didn't turn his head. One of the hands stepped forward. "East corner gate, south pasture. Take the pinto and go now." Pete was out the door. Jacob looked at Caroline. "How did you see the gate hinge?" "I look at things." He picked up a second lantern from the hook by the door, extended it toward her. "Can you ride?" "Yes." "Good." He pushed the back door open against the wind. "Then you're not staying in the house." She hadn't ridden in 2 years, but her body remembered it, the way bodies remember things that were once necessary, not gracefully at first, and then all at once with a kind of muscle memory authority that surprised her. Jacob put her on a steady bay mare named Patience, which she appreciated as a name under the circumstances, and then he was gone into the dark and the rain, with the third hand moving toward the main body of the herd, with the kind of practiced speed that came from doing this in the dark 100 times before. Caroline took Patience toward the east pasture, where she'd seen 2 of the younger steers separated from the main herd earlier in the day. Another thing she'd noticed, another thing she'd filed away without knowing yet whether it would matter. It mattered now. She found them pressed against the fence line, eyes wide, heads low, the lightning doing nothing to help. She worked them back toward the main herd the way she'd watched cowhands do it in Kansas. Not fast, not aggressive, making herself and the horse as calm and steady as the situation allowed, which was not very calm and not very steady, but apparently calm enough because the steers moved. By the time the storm had blown through and Montana storms moved, they didn't linger. They came in fast and hard, and then they went and left the aftermath for you to sort out. The herd was contained. The east corner gate had been reinforced just in time. They'd lost no cattle. She and Jacob Thompson rode back to the barn side by side, soaked through the gray pre-dawn light, beginning to separate the ground from the sky. He hadn't said a word to her since the back porch. Not to her specifically, he'd shouted instructions across the dark. To his hands had moved through the crisis with a focused efficiency she'd found genuinely impressive, but he hadn't spoken to her directly. He did now. "Where did you learn to work cattle?" "I didn't really. I watched cowhands work cattle for 2 years while I was keeping accounts for a freight operation that also ran some cattle on the side. I know enough to be useful in a crisis. I wouldn't claim more than that." "The steers in the east section. I noticed them this afternoon. They looked separated and nervous. I thought they might be the first to bolt if something spooked the herd." He was quiet for a moment. "You noticed that from a wagon. I look at things. The barn doors, the horses into their stalls." He was unsaddling the big roan he'd been riding when he spoke again, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before. Not softness exactly, more like a crack in something that had been sealed for a long time. "You could have stayed in the house." "I know. Most people in a situation like that with someone telling them to stay, they stay." Caroline pulled the saddle from Patience's back. Her arms ached. Her hair was plastered to her neck, and her boots were soaked through, and she was so tired she could feel it in her teeth. "Mr. Thompson, I told you I don't require you to be easy. I also don't require you to protect me from things I can help with. I'm not here to hide in the house while work needs doing." She set the saddle on its rack. "If that's a problem for you, you should tell me now." He stopped. He turned and looked at her across the back of his horse. And then he said it. Quiet. So quiet that the rain still dripping from the barn roof almost covered it. "You're mine tonight, darling." The air went strange. She held his gaze. Didn't flinch. Didn't reach for the door of the barn. Didn't reach for anything. I was watching her. She could see it, even in the half-dark of the barn. This careful, controlled watching, like a man who had said something that surprised himself and was now waiting braced for the reaction he expected. The reaction that every person before her had given him. The flinch. The step back. The careful retreat toward the door, and then the more permanent retreat in the morning with a packed bag and a polite excuse. She looked at him for a long, steady moment. That was a strange thing to say. His jaw tightened. It was. "Were you trying to frighten me?" A pause. "I don't know what I was trying to do." "Were you testing me?" Longer pause. "Maybe." She picked up a dry cloth from the hook and began rubbing down Patience's neck. "Well, whatever you were doing." She said it without looking at him. "I'm still here." She heard him exhale. Not a sigh. Not relief exactly. Something older than relief. Something that sounded like a man who'd been holding a particular breath for a very long time and had just now not been given a reason to hold it anymore. He finished unsaddling his horse in silence. She finished with patience. They walked back to the house in the gray pre-dawn light, not speaking, the dog falling into step behind them as if this were a perfectly ordinary thing. Two people coming in from a storm at 4 in the morning, with the whole wet Montana dark settling around their shoulders. At the back door he stopped. She stopped. "The accounts. Start with the August ledger. The entries aren't missing. They're in a second book I keep in the top desk drawer. I should have told you where it was. Thank you. Get some sleep first." "A few hours." He held the door. She walked through. She didn't look back. But she heard him stand there for a moment before he followed her in that stillness again. The stillness of a man encountering something he didn't have a category for, yet something that hadn't run, something that had looked at the worst of him on offer and simply stayed. She went upstairs. She lay down on the bed with her damp hair spread across the pillow, and she listened to the last of the storm moving east away from the ranch, away from the valley toward whatever came next. She was still there. That was enough for now. The morning came bright and washed clean, the way mornings did after a Montana storm. Everything clarified, everything slightly rearranged, the world looking the same, but feeling subtly, unmistakably different. She was in the kitchen at 5:45, coffee on the stove, when one of the hired hands, not Pete, a younger man, maybe 22, with a round, honest face and eyes that slid sideways with the very specific shyness of a young man who didn't know how to talk to women, came to the back door and stopped short when he saw her. "Oh, you're still here." "I am." He blinked. "Usually by morning." He stopped himself. "Usually by morning what?" He turned red to the roots of his hair. "Nothing, ma'am. I'm Donnie. I work the north pasture mostly. I just came to see if Mr. Thompson needed anything after last night." "He's not up yet. Or if he is, he's not in the house. There's coffee." Donnie looked at the coffee pot, the way a man looks at something he very much wants, but is uncertain whether accepting constitutes a social commitment of some kind. "Thank you, ma'am." He came in and accepted a cup, stood by the door with it, and studied her with the unguarded curiosity of someone who genuinely couldn't understand what he was looking at. "You stayed," he said finally. "I noticed. The other ones? I've been told. Mr. Thompson's he's not a bad man." He said it urgently, like someone making an argument they'd made before and not been believed. "People in town talk like I don't know. They make him sound like something he's not. He's hard to know, that's all. He's just hard to know." Caroline poured her own coffee. "Most worthwhile things are." Donnie looked at her over the rim of his cup. Then he grinned. Sudden, unguarded, the grin of a 22-year-old who'd just heard something that struck him as unexpectedly right. "Yes, ma'am. I reckon that's true." The August ledger was exactly where Jacob had said it would be, top desk drawer, second book in. She spread it open beside the primary ledger on the desk in the front room, and spent the next 3 hours cross-referencing entries with the kind of focused attention that made the rest of the world go quiet. It was a bigger mess than she'd expected. Not because Jacob Thompson was careless, quite the opposite. The man was meticulous in his way. But he was one person trying to manage the accounts of an operation that had clearly grown faster than his record-keeping system had grown with it, and the cracks were showing. There were 3 separate payment records for the same supplier in August, identical amounts, different dates. Either the supplier had been paid 3 times, or the records had been entered 3 times, or something in between that would need careful untangling. There was a significant expense in September, with no corresponding entry in the accounts receivable column that should have reflected its purpose. And there was something else. A set of figures in the back of the secondary ledger that didn't correspond to anything she could find in the primary. Not operational expenses, not payroll, not supply costs. A name repeated across 3 separate entries: Caldwell Land and Cattle. She didn't know that name. She wrote it down. She was still writing when she heard Jacob's boots on the floor above her, and then on the stairs, and then he appeared in the doorway of the front room, and stopped when he saw the 2 ledgers spread open and the pages of notes she'd already generated. He looked at the notes, looked at her. "You've been at this since 5:45. She set down her pen. "The August supplier payments, Grover's Dry Goods. There are 3 payment entries for the same amount across the same billing period. Have you checked whether you actually paid them 3 times, or whether 1 payment, 3 entries? He crossed the room and stood on the other side of the desk. "The bookkeeping wasn't. I had a man doing it last winter. He left in March. Since then it's been—" He stopped. "It's been me mostly. Partly you, and partly whoever else was available by the looks of it. I can see at least 3 different handwriting styles in the primary ledger." He put his hands on the edge of the desk and looked down at the open pages. She watched his face, not intrusively, just attending to it, the way you attend to something that gives you information you need. I was not a man who liked being shown that things had gotten away from him. She could see that. The tightening around his jaw, the slight compression of something in his expression. But he wasn't going to lie about it either. "It's worse than it looks." "That's what I suspected." He looked up. "How bad? I need another day with these books before I can tell you with any confidence. But—" She tapped the secondary ledger, "These entries. Caldwell Land and Cattle. Can you tell me what those are?" The change in his expression was immediate and not small. He straightened up. His hands came off the desk. "Where did you see that?" "Secondary ledger, back pages, 3 entries over the last 6 months. They're not categorized under any of your standard expense columns. They look like—" She searched for the right word. "Payments of some kind. But to a company I can't identify in relation to anything else in these records." Jacob Thompson was very still. "That's not a company I do business with." "But the entries? Those entries were not made by me." The room was quiet. Caroline looked at the ledger, looked at him. "Someone else entered these?" "Yes." "One of the 3 other people writing in your books?" "Yes." His voice had gone very flat and very controlled. "And I need to know." He stopped, exhaled, started again. "I need you to pull every entry with that name in both books and give me dates and amounts. Can you do that today?" "I can do it in 2 hours." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, something she couldn't fully name. Not gratitude exactly, though there was an element of that. More like the expression of a man who had been trying to hold a leaking thing shut with his hands for a long time and had just been offered a bucket. "Do it." He left the room. She heard him go through the kitchen, through the back door, out toward the barn, and his footsteps had a different quality to them than they'd had this morning. Faster, more urgent. Whatever Caldwell Land and Cattle was, it was not nothing. Caroline pulled the secondary ledger toward her, turned to the back pages, and began to write. By midday, she had 6 entries, not 3. The other 3 had been hiding inside what looked like routine expense categories, until you cross-referenced them against the dates and realized the amounts were off. Total $430, over 7 months. In a ranch operation where a single bad season could tip the balance, that wasn't a trivial amount. She heard the back door, and then Jacob was in the doorway again. He had a look on his face she hadn't seen before, tight and controlled on the surface, but underneath it, something that was working hard not to be anger. 6 entries, she said before he could speak. She turned the paper toward him. $430 total, 7 months. The earliest one is dated last November. He looked at the paper. Walt Greer, he said quietly, one of the men who was writing in the ledger. He managed the books from October until March. I let him go in March. He picked up the paper, set it down, picked it up again. I let him go because I suspected he was skimming supply payments. Turned out I was right, but I couldn't prove it clearly enough to do anything but dismiss him. And Caldwell Land and Cattle? Jacob's jaw worked. Caldwell is a land developer out of Billings. He's been trying to buy up land in this valley for 3 years. Every rancher who's run into trouble in that time... He stopped. 3 ranches have sold in this valley since Caldwell started operating here. 2 of them sold because they believed they had financial problems they couldn't recover from. The silence stretched. Caroline looked at the figures on the page, looked at him. You think Greer was working for Caldwell? I think Greer was paid to create a picture of financial trouble in my books that would make it look like the Diamond Tea was failing. And then Caldwell would approach you. And then Caldwell would approach me. He set the paper down. He already has, twice. Both times I told him the ranch wasn't for sale. And the third time, he looked at her steadily. He hasn't made a third approach yet. But he will. Yes. He reached across the desk and picked up the pen she'd set down, held it for a moment, set it back down. He will. Caroline looked at the ledger, at the hidden entries, at the long patient trail of a fraud designed to make a solvent ranch look like it was drowning. Mr. Thompson. She kept her voice level. Give me 3 days with these books, and I will give you a clear documented account of every entry that was made by Greer. I will cross-reference it against every supplier receipt and payroll record you have. When Caldwell makes his third approach, and he cites your financial position, and he will, because that's what men like him do, you will have documentation that refutes every number he puts in front of you. Jacob Thompson looked at her for a long moment. The dog had appeared in the doorway behind him. It sat down, tilted its head, and looked at her with an expression that managed to convey both inquiry and encouragement, which was more than she'd expected from a dog. 3 days, Jacob said. 3 days. He nodded, started to leave, stopped, turned back. You stayed this morning. She met his eyes. I did. Everyone else. I'm not everyone else. The words landed simply without drama, without the weight of a pronouncement. Just a fact. A clear, plain-spoken fact. Jacob Thompson looked at her for 3 full seconds. Then he turned and walked back out toward the barn. And somewhere in the quiet of the front room, with the Montana sun moving across the desk and the ledger books open in front of her, and the whole complicated, dangerous, worthwhile truth of it beginning to come clear on the page, Caroline Miller felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She was exactly where she needed to be, and she was not leaving. Behind her, she could hear Donnie very quietly whistling, and that small sound followed her all the way to the back door. A sound so ordinary and so unexpectedly warm that she had to stop for just a moment on the porch steps and let it settle before she went inside. The dinner that night was not a simple thing, though it looked like one. 2 people at a table, food between them, a lamp burning. Outside, the ordinary sounds of a ranch settling into its evening horses, shifting in the barn, the far-off sound of the creek, the dog moving on the porch. But the quality of the silence between them had changed again, and they both knew it, and neither of them addressed it directly, because some things are better approached sideways if you want to approach them honestly. Jacob passed the bread without being asked. She noted this because he hadn't done it before. Henderson will send word when he's ready for the next step, Jacob said. He'll need the sworn statements from both of us first. He said he'd have the forms ready by end of week. I'll be ready when he is. Jacob looked at his plate. Then, I told Donnie this afternoon about the lien, about what we found. He paused. He took it the way Donnie takes most things. How is that? like the world had personally offended him and he intended to do something about it. A pause that carried the weight of something close to affection. He wanted to ride to Millhaven tonight and find Caldwell's man himself. You talked him out of it. Barely. He reached for his coffee. He's loyal to a fault, that boy. I've never been entirely sure I deserve it. She looked at him steadily. He thinks you do. Donnie thinks a lot of things. He thinks you're a good man who's hard to know. She picked up her fork. His words. Jacob went quiet, in the particular way. He went quiet when something had landed somewhere real in him. Not silence as withdrawal, but silence as absorption. He said that. Yes. To you, after 3 days. I was worried you'd frighten me off. She met his eyes across the table. He was defending you before he knew whether I needed defending from you or not. That says something about the kind of loyalty you've built here, whether you acknowledge it or not. Jacob looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his expression, complicated, not entirely comfortable, the expression of a man receiving information about himself that he couldn't immediately categorize as either true or false, and so was holding it carefully until he could determine which. He was right to worry, Jacob said finally, about frightening people off. Were you trying to frighten me that first night in the barn? He was quiet. Jacob. Yes. The word came out flat and honest. Not to harm you, but to see what you'd do. You test people. I've found it's the fastest way to know who they actually are. She nodded slowly. And what did you find out? He looked at her directly. That you look at things. She held his gaze. I do. He picked up his coffee and looked away first. But it wasn't the looking away of a man retreating. It was the looking away of a man who needed a moment to decide how much ground he was prepared to cede in a single evening. She let him have it. 3 days passed in a rhythm that felt to Caroline like the particular rhythm of something beginning to work properly, the way a clock sounds after it's been regulated. Each gear finding its relationship to the others, the whole mechanism coming into its proper beat. She finished the ledger documentation. Every entry cross-referenced. Every falsification flagged. Every legitimate record confirmed by its corresponding receipt. She organized it into a clear sequence that told the story of what Walt Greer had done with the Diamond Tease books in plain, incontrovertible language that any judge or lawyer in the territory could follow without difficulty. She started managing the kitchen properly, not just cooking meals, but organizing the supply system so that nothing ran out without advance warning, so that the pantry told you what it contained without you having to dig through it, so that the particular chaos of a household, run by a man who treated domestic management as an afterthought, was gradually replaced by something that actually functioned. Jacob noticed. She could tell because his manner in the kitchen changed. He moved through it differently with slightly less of the braced quality of a man navigating a space that had always given him minor trouble. She reorganized his filing system, the papers on the desk, the records from the wooden box, all of it sorted and labeled and put in a sequence that made sense. When she was finished, the front room had the quiet authority of a place where things could be found. He stood in the doorway the evening she finished and looked at it for a long time without speaking. This is what the room was supposed to look like, he said finally. When my father built this house. She turned to look at him. Did he keep good records? Meticulous. He crossed to the desk and ran a hand across the edge of the organized stack. He said the books were the conscience of the operation. If the books were right, you knew where you stood. If they were wrong, you were lying to yourself. His words exactly. He picked up a ledger, turned it over in his hands. He died when I was 26. Everything after that I was figuring out as I went. You built this operation. I kept it alive. It wasn't the same thing. He put the ledger back down. My father he was the kind of man who made everyone around him better without trying. The hands who worked for him stayed for years. People came to him when they had problems. He looked at the organized desk. I've never managed that. Donnie's been here 3 years. A pause. Yes. Pete's been here 5 by the look of the handwriting on the older payroll sheets. She kept her voice even. The hands who leave, some of them leave because a thing isn't right for them, not because the man they're working for is wrong. He looked at her. You're being generous. I'm being accurate. There's a difference. She picked up her notes. I'm not telling you that you're easy, Jacob. I'm telling you that easy isn't the same as worth it. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then he walked out of the room, and she heard him go upstairs, and she sat down at the desk and let out a long, quiet breath, because some things she'd learned needed to be said, and then let alone left in the room like a lamp burning, allowed to shed light at their own pace. The morning Caldwell came. It was a Tuesday. She knew it before she saw him, heard the particular sound of a horse and buggy on the drive that was too deliberate, too considered, the sound of someone who'd planned his arrival down to the hour. She was at the front room window, and she had enough time to see the rig and the man driving it, and the second man riding alongside, before she went to the back door and called across the yard. Jacob. He came out of the barn with Pete 2 steps behind him. She didn't need to say anything else. He looked at the drive. His expression went very still. Go inside. No. He turned to look at her. His jaw was set. Jacob. She kept her voice low and level. I have the documentation. It's on the desk. Let him come to the door. Let him make his offer. Don't react. Let him talk. She held his eyes. You know what he's going to say, because we've already heard it from a different angle. Let him say it. Pete looked between them, said nothing, stepped back. Jacob looked at the approaching buggy, then at her. All right. Caldwell was not what she'd expected, which she acknowledged to herself even as she held her expression neutral. She'd expected overt menace, a large man, loud, the kind of physical presence that was designed to overwhelm. Instead, Caldwell was of moderate height and medium build, somewhere in his mid-50s, with a careful quality to his grooming and his clothing that spoke of a man who understood the power of looking respectable. He had a broad, pleasant face with small eyes that were not pleasant at all, and he moved with the ease of a man who had never been physically afraid of anything in his life, because he'd always had other people afraid of him instead. The man who'd ridden alongside him stayed with the horses. Caldwell came to the porch. Jacob stood at the foot of the steps and didn't invite him up. Thompson. Caldwell's voice was smooth, a salesman's voice, the kind that had learned to stay warm at a controlled temperature. It's been a while. Not long enough. Jacob's voice was flat. What do you want, Caldwell? A slight adjustment in Caldwell's expression, mild surprise at the directness quickly smoothed over. I'm here to talk about an opportunity. I think there are some things you don't know about your own situation that... I know my situation. I don't think you do. Not fully. Caldwell reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. I've had my people look at the Diamond T's financial position, and I want to be honest with you, I'm concerned. I'm not here as an adversary. I'm here as, you're here to make an offer on my land. A pause. A recalibration behind those small eyes. I'm here to offer you a way out of a situation that's more precarious than you realize. What situation is that? Your operating margins have been deteriorating for 7 months. Your water access on the eastern boundary is legally complicated. He said it with smooth regret, the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis he's practiced delivering. There's a lien on that parcel, Jacob. I don't know if you're aware. I'm aware. A flicker. Quickly controlled. Then you know it creates a question about the long-term viability of Mr. Caldwell. He looked at Caroline. She'd come to stand beside Jacob, not behind him, not to his left or right, by enough distance to be separate, but beside him close enough that the positioning was unmistakable. I don't believe we've met, Caldwell said. We haven't. My name is Caroline Miller. I manage the Diamond T's accounts. She held the folder she'd brought with her. You mentioned that Mr. Thompson's operating margins have been deteriorating. I'd be curious to know which figures you're using because the ones I've been working with tell a different story. A longer pause. Caldwell looked at her with an expression that was reconfiguring itself carefully, like a man who had walked into a room expecting it to be empty and found it furnished. Your figures, he said carefully. The Diamond T's figures, accurately recorded. She opened the folder. Your concern about the eastern boundary lien is noted. We visited the Millhaven Land Registry last week. The filing has been formally flagged as containing documentation inconsistencies, specifically a forged authorization signature and a forged property owner signature on the lien itself. She kept her voice conversational. The ranch's lawyer, Mr. Henderson, is currently preparing a formal challenge. We expect the lien to be voided. The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man whose carefully constructed approach has encountered something that was not supposed to be in the room. A forged... Caldwell stopped, restarted. That's a significant claim. It's a documented claim. She extended a sheet from the folder, a copy of Albert Foss's notation in the registry record, Henderson's summary of the evidentiary position, Jacob's sworn statement regarding the signature. You're welcome to review the documentation. He didn't take it. His eyes moved from the paper to her face to Jacob's face and back again. Who are you? He said, and the smooth warmth had gone out of his voice entirely, replaced by something stripped down and cold underneath. I told you. Caroline Miller, Diamond T Accounts Manager. You've been here less than 2 weeks. 8 days. She closed the folder. Long enough. Caldwell turned to Jacob. He was recalibrating again. She could see the process happening behind his face, the rapid reassessment of a plan encountering an obstacle it hadn't accounted for. Jacob, I'd like to speak with you directly about the specific financial position of this ranch which your employee may not have the full picture of. She has the full picture. Jacob's voice was quiet. She has a fuller picture than you were counting on, and a fuller picture than your man Greer left in those books. Another silence. Caldwell's face went through something. I don't know what you think you... Walt Greer. Jacob's voice was still quiet, still controlled. He worked for me from October to March. And before that, he worked for you. He held Caldwell's gaze. Henderson has that too. The air on the porch changed. Caldwell stood very still. The pleasant face had not moved, but something behind it had shifted fundamentally, the way the surface of water looks calm until you see the current underneath it. You'd have trouble proving, Mr. Caldwell. Caroline kept her voice steady and clear. I want to make sure I understand the position you're in, so I can describe it to Mr. Henderson accurately when we speak with him tomorrow. She paused. The Diamond T is not in financial distress. Its books were made to appear that way through a deliberate systematic alteration of its records, which we have documented in full. Its eastern boundary lien was filed using forged signatures, which we have documented in full and flagged with the registry. The fraud that was used to construct this position originated with an individual who was in your employ before he entered Mr. Thompson's employment, and we have documented the timeline. She held his gaze. So when you made this visit today to present Mr. Thompson with a picture of his own precarious financial situation and offer him a way out of it, you were relying on documentation that we can now demonstrate was false, and you were relying on a lien that we can now demonstrate was fraudulent. A pause. I want to make sure you understand that before you say anything else. The silence stretched for 5 full seconds. Caldwell looked at her. His expression did something she hadn't seen it do, yet it lost its management. Just for a moment, just a flicker. The careful, cultivated pleasantness cracked, and what was underneath it was not rage exactly, but something older and colder. The expression of a man who has operated for a long time, from the certainty that his methods would not be exposed encountering for the first time someone who has exposed them. He looked at Jacob. This isn't over, he said quietly. No, Jacob said, but it's not going the way you planned. Caldwell turned, walked back to his rig with the same careful, composed stride he'd arrived with because men like Caldwell, Caroline noted, maintained their composure on the way out as a matter of survival, because composure was part of the armor, and if the armor broke in retreat, there was nothing left. He said something to the man with the horses. They drove back down the drive. Pete appeared from around the corner of the barn, where he'd apparently been standing the entire time. He looked at Jacob, looked at Caroline, looked at Jacob again. Well, Pete said. He was a man of few words, Pete. He'd apparently used his limit. Jacob turned to Caroline. She met his eyes. Something moved through his expression. Something that was not the careful control he'd held through the entire confrontation. Not the flat authority he kept available for moments that required it. Something that was unguarded and direct and had considerable weight behind it. That was... He stopped. Necessary. Yes. He looked out at the road where Caldwell's rig had disappeared. Is it enough to stop him? Enough to stop him from using those tools, yes. Enough to expose him. Henderson needs more time. She closed the folder under her arm. He won't come back to this door. He'll work through different channels now. What channels? I don't know yet, but he will. Men like that don't stop, they reroute. She looked at Jacob directly. Which means we need Henderson to move as quickly as possible. And it means you need to be prepared for Caldwell to try something less straightforward. Jacob nodded slowly. He was still looking at the road. Then he said, You said we. She paused. What? You said which means we need Henderson to move quickly. He turned to look at her. You said we. She held his gaze. I did. He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was full now, direct and clear, and it did nothing to soften either of their faces, which she thought was appropriate. There was nothing here that needed softening. Caroline. He said her name the way he'd been saying it for 3 days, but this time with something additional in it, something that had come loose from wherever he'd been keeping it contained. Why are you still here? I work here. That's not what I mean. She knew it wasn't. I know. Then answer the question. She looked at him for a long moment. The question was real, and it deserved a real answer, and she'd been turning the real answer over in her mind for 3 days without fully committing to the language of it, because language made things actual, and actual things had weight, and weight had consequences. Because this is worth staying for. His jaw tightened slightly. The work. Jacob. He waited. Not just the work. The silence between them had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not the silence of two people managing distance, but the silence of two people standing at the edge of something they haven't named yet and haven't decided whether to name. Pete coughed from somewhere behind them and then walked very deliberately away toward the barn. Jacob looked at Caroline. Dinner tonight, he said quietly. I'll cook. She looked back at him. You cook when something's bothering you. Yes. Is something bothering you? A pause. The corner of his mouth moved the closest thing to a smile she'd seen yet, and it landed again with the same quiet force. Yes. Considerably. He went inside. She stood on the porch for a moment and breathed and looked out at the clear Montana morning and felt something she recognized from a long time ago, from before the years of careful maintenance and managed distance and making do. Felt it the way you feel something returning that you'd convinced yourself you could live without. She went inside. The letter from Henderson arrived 4 days later. She was at the desk when Jacob brought it in from the post he'd ridden to town himself that morning, which he didn't usually do, and came back with 3 envelopes and the expression of a man who had already looked at the outside of Henderson's envelope enough times to have memorized it. She opened it. She read it. She set it on the desk. 2 things. He was standing across the desk. Tell me. The good thing first. Henderson has found 2 previous instances of lien filings using similar documentation patterns in adjacent counties. One of them has already been challenged by the property owner. Henderson believed that if he can establish a pattern that the same method was used across multiple properties, it significantly strengthens the fraud case against whoever orchestrated it. And the second thing, Caldwell has filed a complaint with the Territorial Land Office against you. She kept her voice steady. He's claiming that the Diamond T has been operating in violation of its water rights agreement on the eastern boundary, that the agreement your father signed in 1882 limited the ranch's water usage from the creek to specific quantities, and that you've been in violation of those limits. Jacob went very still. What agreement? There is apparently a document on file with the land office, signed by your father, dated March 1882. I know every document my father signed in 1882. There was no water rights limitation agreement. I know. She picked up the letter again. Henderson says the same thing we found with the lien. The signature on the document appears consistent with your father's recorded signature, but the document itself doesn't appear in any of your father's records or correspondence, because it's forged. Almost certainly, but it's on file, and Caldwell has filed a formal complaint referencing it. She set the letter down, which means the land office is going to want to investigate, and during that investigation, they could restrict my water usage. Yes. On the eastern pasture. Yes. He walked to the window, stood there. She could see him working through it the particular way his posture changed when he was processing something that required all his available capacity going tight and then deliberately, effortfully evening out. It's the same method, he said finally. Different document. Yes, he's pivoted from the lien to a different attack on the same target. The water rights. He's not going to stop. No. She paused. But Jacob, he's using the same method, which means he's working from the same playbook, and we've already read it. She waited until he turned from the window to look at her. Your father's records from 1882, do you have them? A pause. In the barn, there are boxes. I need them. He stopped, started again. It's years of paper, letters, receipts, legal documents, land records. My father kept everything. Good. She picked up her pen. Because everything is what I need. He looked at her across the desk. The afternoon light was coming through the window behind him, and his face was in partial shadow, and she could see clearly the exhaustion in it. Not physical exhaustion, though he worked hard enough to have that too, but the specific exhaustion of a man who has been fighting a battle on multiple fronts without knowing where the next attack was coming from, or when carrying all of it alone for longer than any person should carry things alone. Caroline. His voice was lower than usual. This is... He stopped. I know. You've been here 11 days. 12. 12 days. He looked at the desk, at the organized records, the documentation, the letter from Henderson. And in 12 days you've... He stopped again. He was a man who ran out of words at exactly the moments when the words mattered most, she'd noticed. Not from lack of feeling. From the opposite. Jacob. She set down her pen. Get the boxes. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went. She found the relevant record on the second day. Not a 1882 water rights limitation agreement that didn't exist and never had, but something better. A letter from her father's own lawyer, written in March 1882, confirming the recording of the original Diamond T water rights claim, unlimited riparian rights to the creek for the property's full frontage, and specifically noting that no limitations or sharing agreements had been or would be attached to the claim. It was a lawyer's letter confirming the absence of exactly the document Caldwell had filed. She brought it to Jacob at the supper table that evening. He read it twice. He wrote this because someone tried to limit the water rights in 1882, Jacob said slowly. Someone tried then, and my father fought it, and his lawyer documented the outcome. That's what it looks like. Which means someone has been trying to take this land's water rights for more than 20 years. Or Caldwell found the old attempt and used the same tactic. She sat down across from him. Either way, this letter directly contradicts the document Caldwell filed. A letter from your father's own lawyer, dated the same month as the supposed agreement confirming those rights were unrestricted. Jacob set the letter down on the table. He put his hands flat on either side of it. I need to take this to Henderson. Tomorrow. Tonight. Jacob. Henderson is in Millhaven. It's dark. First light then. He looked at the letter. First light. First light. She picked up her fork. Eat your dinner. It's getting cold. He looked at her. She'd said it the way you said things to someone you'd been alongside for a while. Naturally, without calculation. The way people talked to each other when they'd stopped managing the distance between them and started simply occupying the same space. He heard it that way too. She could see it. He picked up his fork. They ate in a silence that was by now completely different from the silence of 12 days ago. This silence had furniture in it. History. A shared understanding of a situation that neither of them had chosen, but that had built between them something real. After supper, he stood from the table and picked up the letter and held it for a moment. My father would have... He stopped. She waited. He would have liked you, Jacob said quietly. He would have said you were the kind of person who looked at things until they told you the truth. She held very still. He set the letter on the desk and went upstairs. She sat at the table for a long time afterward, listening to the ranch settle into its night sounds. The creek in the distance, the dog on the porch, the whole quiet Montana dark, pressing down on the house, and everything inside it. She was not a woman who cried easily, but she sat there for a long time. The day they went to Henderson's office together, Jacob and Caroline, and the full documentation, the letter from 1882, the ledger analysis, the Millhaven registry notation. Everything was a Friday. Henderson read the new letter 3 times. When he finished, he set it on his desk with the particular care of a man handling something that has quite suddenly become considerably more significant than he'd expected. This changes things substantially. How substantially? Caroline kept her voice even. The combination of this letter establishing that the water rights were confirmed unrestricted in 1882 by legal documentation with the pattern evidence I've been building across the 3 counties. He looked at Jacob. I believe we have grounds to take this to the territorial judge in Helena. Not just to challenge the individual filings, but to make a case for a broader pattern of fraudulent land acquisition. Jacob leaned forward. That's federal jurisdiction. Potentially, yes. That's considerably larger than Harlan Creek, yes. Henderson looked at the papers in front of him. If a federal investigation is opened, Caldwell's operations across the entire territory come under scrutiny. Every property he's acquired in the last 3 years. Every ranch that sold because its owner believed financial trouble, they couldn't recover from trouble that was manufactured the same way yours was manufactured. He paused. This goes well beyond the Diamond T. Jacob. The room was very quiet. Caroline looked at Jacob. He was looking at Henderson's desk at the accumulated documentation of a fraud that had consumed years of people's lives. People's land. People's futures, with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not anger. Something past anger. Something that was about more than his own ranch, his own situation, his own survival. What do we need to do? Jacob's voice was steady. You would need to be willing to be the primary complainant. Your case is the most fully documented. Your name goes on the formal complaint. Henderson looked at him directly. That puts you in a visible position. Caldwell will know you were the one who brought this. His response may not be, I understand the risk. I want to make sure via Henderson. Jacob's voice was quiet. Final. I understand the risk. Henderson looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Caroline. His expression was thoughtful and not entirely readable. Miss Miller. He picked up a pen. The ledger analysis you prepared, would you be willing to present that testimony formally before a judge? She looked at Jacob. He was looking at her. Yes, she said. I would. Henderson nodded. Then we have work to do. They were in his office for 3 hours. When they came back down the narrow staircase into the afternoon, Jacob stopped on the boardwalk and ran his hand across the back of his neck, the way he'd done that first day in Millhaven, and exhaled and stood there for a moment looking at the street. Then he turned to her. There are things I haven't said. She waited. About why this ranch, what it means. My father built it. He spent 30 years building it. He built it for... He stopped, looked away, looked back. It was supposed to be for a family, a whole life inside it. And then he died and the family didn't happen, and it was just me and the work and I... He stopped again. I let the books get away from me because I didn't have anyone to be careful for. Do you understand that there's a difference between maintaining something for yourself and maintaining something for... He stopped. She waited. I'm trying to say something. And I'm doing it badly. I know what you're trying to say. He looked at her. I'm not going anywhere. The words were the same words she'd been living out for 12 days. But this time said here on this boardwalk after everything. They had a different weight. A declarative weight. A weight that acknowledged what had built between them as something that both of them knew and neither of them had named, and that was about to be named whether they'd planned to name it or not. Jacob Thompson looked at Caroline Miller in the afternoon light of a Friday in Millhaven with the evidence of a fraud they'd dismantled together, filed in a lawyer's office above their heads, and he said nothing. But he reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, not with the self-consciousness of a man performing an action for an audience, just simply directly the way you reached for something real. She let him hold it. They stood on the boardwalk for a moment. Two people who had arrived at something they hadn't set out to arrive at, through the particular route of honesty and work, and showing up when it would have been easier not to. Then she squeezed his hand once, and they walked back to the buckboard. Together. Her hand no longer in his, but the fact of him having reached for it hanging between them, like something that had been spoken aloud, and could not be unspoken, which was, she thought, exactly as it should be. The ride back from Millhaven took 40 minutes. They didn't speak for the first 20. Not because something was wrong, because something was right, and neither of them wanted to disturb it with words that might not be equal to it yet. The road ran through open country, and the late afternoon light came flat and gold across the grass, and Jacob drove with both hands on the reins and his eyes on the road, and Caroline sat beside him close enough that their shoulders nearly touched on the turns. It was Donnie who broke the spell in the most Donnie way possible. I was waiting at the gate when they pulled in, not casually, not accidentally, but with the transparent eagerness of a young man who had been watching the road for 2 hours and had not quite mastered the art of pretending otherwise. Henderson, did he? Yes. Jacob stepped down from the buckboard. And the letter, the one from your father's lawyer? Yes. And Caldwell? Donnie. Jacob handed him the reins. We'll talk at supper. Donnie looked at Caroline as she climbed down. She gave him a small nod. His face split into a grin so wide it looked like it might cause him structural damage. Yes, sir, he said, and led the horse away at a pace that suggested he was going to tell Pete everything he'd just inferred from 2 words and a nod before the buckboard was fully unhitched. Jacob watched him go. Something in his expression was she searched for the word. Fond. It was fond with the particular quality of a man who hadn't known he was capable of fond until he was already feeling it. He's going to wake up the whole bunkhouse, Jacob said. Let him. She picked up her folder. They deserve to know it's going well. They've been working this ranch through everything Caldwell tried to do to it. They have a stake in this too. He looked at her. You're right. I usually am. She said it without vanity, the way you stated a fact you'd earned. Come on, I'll start dinner. You can tell me what you didn't say to Henderson this afternoon. He followed her inside. She was at the stove, and he was at the kitchen table. He'd started sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings the last few days while she cooked, which was a thing she'd noticed, and filed alongside all the other things she'd noticed about the gradual, incremental way Jacob Thompson had begun to occupy his own house differently when he said it. Henderson asked me while you stepped out to speak with the clerk. He asked me how long you'd been working here. She didn't turn from the stove. What did you tell him? 12 days. What did he say? He said, a pause. He said that in his experience, a person who could do what you'd done in 12 days was not a person who should be in a temporary arrangement. She was quiet for a moment. And what did you say? I didn't say anything. She turned around. He was looking at his hands on the table, both of them flat, the way they'd been on the table that night with the letter from 1882, like a man bracing himself on a surface while the ground underneath it shifts. Jacob. He looked up. Say what you didn't say to Henderson. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the early evening sounds of the ranch, the bunkhouse, the horses. Donnie's voice somewhere distant telling Pete something with considerable emphasis. I don't know how to do this, Jacob said. I want to be honest with you about that. I have spent a long time convincing myself and everyone around me that I was fine alone. That alone was a choice rather than a result. He paused. It was a result. I know you know. He looked at her steadily. That's part of what I mean. You've been here 12 days, and you know things about me that people who've known me for years don't know. And I don't know whether that's... He stopped. I don't know whether that frightens me, or whether what frightens me is the idea of you not being here." She crossed to the table and sat down across from him, folded her hands, looked at him directly. "What happened?" she said. "Before. The thing that made alone feel safer." His jaw moved. "You don't need. I'm not asking because I need to. I'm asking because you need to say it." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he looked at his hands. "Her name was Margaret. We were supposed to marry in the spring of 1880. She'd come from back east Ohio. She was everything I thought I wanted. Educated, capable, she seemed to understand what this life was." He was quiet. "She left in February, 2 months before the wedding. She left a letter." Another pause. "She said that she'd realized she couldn't be what this life required, that she'd tried to see herself here, and she couldn't." He stopped. "She said that loving me had made her understand herself better, and what she understood was that she wasn't built for Montana." Caroline looked at him. "She was right," he said flatly. "She was absolutely right, and I knew it before she left, and the letter it was honest. She was an honest woman. There was nothing cruel about it." He paused. "And I spent 4 years being angry at her for it anyway, because it was easier than being angry at the right thing." What was the right thing? The fact that I had built something so relentlessly self-sufficient that there was no room for another person inside it. He looked up. "You understand, I hadn't built a life. I'd built a fort. And then I was surprised when someone looked at the fort and decided they didn't want to live in a fort." The kitchen held this for a moment. "And after Margaret," she said carefully, "after Margaret, I decided that was fine, that I was the kind of man who was better alone, that the work was enough." He paused. "And then I placed an advertisement in the Helena Gazette, because the books were a disaster, and I told myself I needed a household manager, someone competent, a professional arrangement." He looked at her. "I wrote that advertisement 3 times before I sent it, kept starting it differently. The final version. Long hours, adequate accommodations." Something crossed his face. "Yes. I thought that was honest." "It was honest about the work. It wasn't honest about—" He stopped. "I don't know what I was looking for. I told myself I wasn't looking for anything." He held her gaze. "And then you stepped off that stagecoach, and you looked at my gate hinge, and you stayed when you were supposed to leave, and you looked at my books, and you looked at me. You looked at everything the same way. Like everything was worth looking at carefully." She was very still. "I don't know what to do with that," he said quietly. "I want to be honest about that too. I know what I feel. I don't know what I'm allowed to ask for." "You can ask," she said. Her voice was steady. "You just have to actually ask." He looked at her. "Don't test me this time," she said. "Don't make it a thing you say sideways to see how I react. Ask me directly." Jacob Thompson looked at Caroline Miller across a kitchen table in Montana on a Friday evening in October, with everything they'd built in 2 weeks of honesty and work and showing up sitting between them, and he said directly, "Stay. Not as an employee. Stay because you want to be here. Stay because—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. He pushed through it. "Stay because I don't want to find out what this place feels like when you're gone." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything that had been building since a storm in a barn and a quiet sentence in the dark. "I'm already staying," she said. "I've been staying." She held his gaze. "That's what I've been telling you for 2 weeks, Jacob. Every time I didn't leave. That was me telling you." He exhaled. It was the same exhale she'd heard in the barn that first night, the long-held breath of a man who has been braced against something and has just been given permission, finally, to put it down. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his. "All right," he said quietly. "All right," she said back. Outside, Donnie's voice rose on some point of particular emphasis that made Pete's low laugh carry all the way to the kitchen window. The stove crackled. The dog moved on the porch. She squeezed his hand and got up to tend the stove before the supper burned. He sat at the table and watched her and didn't say another word and didn't need to. The letter from Helena came 11 days later. Henderson had moved faster than any of them had expected, which said something either about the strength of the case or about the fact that certain people in the territorial capital had been waiting for exactly this kind of documented complaint against Caldwell's operations with the same suppressed urgency that a wound waits for a doctor. Probably both. The letter informed Jacob that a federal land office investigation had been formally opened, that the specific properties involved the Diamond T's eastern boundary lien and the 1882 water rights document were under review, that investigators would be making contact within the week, and that, as a related matter, inquiries had been opened into Mountain Standard Holdings, which had been identified as connected to 3 additional fraudulent filings in 2 adjacent counties. Jacob read it at the desk. Then he handed it to Caroline without a word and went to the window. She read it. Jacob, I know. This is larger than we expected, even from what Henderson said. Yes. A federal investigation. They're taking it seriously. Yes. He turned from the window. Caldwell's going to know within days that this has gone federal. If he has any political connections in Helena. Henderson anticipated that. Look at the second page. He crossed to the desk and read the second page. His expression changed. Henderson had moved to protect the investigation on exactly that front, had filed simultaneously with 2 different offices, had ensured that the initial complaint was on record through channels that Caldwell's political connections would find difficult to quietly redirect. He was thorough, Jacob said. Henderson is a very good lawyer. He said that was your doing. The way the documentation was organized. He said it was the clearest evidentiary package he'd received in 20 years of practice. She looked at the letter rather than at him. He's generous. He's accurate. Jacob set the letter on the desk. He was looking at her with that direct, steady quality she'd come to know as his version of an embrace, the full attention he gave to things he valued. Caroline. When this is over, when Henderson finishes, when the investigation concludes, when all of it is settled. Jacob. I'm trying to say something. I know, but you don't have to plan it for after everything is settled. You can just say it now. He paused, looked at her. I want you to stay, permanently, not as... He stopped. I want to marry you. I'm doing this badly. She looked at him for a moment. Then, you're doing it fine. Is that a... Yes. She said it clearly, simply. The way she'd been saying everything to him for 23 days without armor, without qualification. Yes, Jacob, that's what I'm saying. He stood across the desk from her, and something in his face did a thing she hadn't seen it do before, something that was not controlled or managed or held at a deliberate distance from its own feeling. Something open. Something that looked for a moment exactly like what it was. She looked at him, looking like that, and thought, there it is. There's the man that was always in there. All right, he said, for the 3rd time in 2 weeks with the same word carrying an entirely different universe of meaning each time he said it. All right, she said back, for the 3rd time. The dog appeared in the doorway of the front room, regarded them both with its customary philosophical composure, and then turned and walked back to the porch. The federal investigators arrived on a Wednesday. 2 men from the Helena Land Office, formal and precise, who spent 3 hours at the desk in the front room going through Caroline's documentation with the particular thoroughness of men who had been told by their supervisor that this case needed to be airtight and intended to make it so. The taller one, a man named Garrett, who had the careful eyes of someone who'd spent a career looking for the specific places where documents said different things than they should, set down Caroline's ledger analysis after 40 minutes and looked at Jacob. Mr. Thompson, who prepared this? Jacob nodded toward Caroline, who was sitting in the chair by the window. Garrett looked at her. You compiled this? Yes. Your training. 3 years as a bookkeeper for a freight operation in St. Louis. 2 years managing private household accounts. And the last 3 weeks working with these specific records. She kept her voice level. The methodology is straightforward. Every falsified entry is cross-referenced against its corresponding physical receipt. The receipts were kept in a wooden box in the bottom desk drawer. Whoever altered the ledgers didn't know they existed. Garrett looked at his colleague. His colleague looked at the documentation. This is... Garrett stopped. This is exactly the kind of thing we've been trying to build in the adjacent counties and haven't been able to because the physical receipts weren't available. In one of those cases, the rancher burned what he thought were old records before anyone told him not to. He turned back to Caroline. You kept everything. Jacob kept everything. I found it. Garrett made a note. His colleague made a note. They asked questions for 2 more hours. Caroline answered most of them. Jacob answered the ones that required his direct testimony, the identification of the forged signatures, the timeline of Greer's employment, the history of Caldwell's approaches. Their answers built on each other without gaps, without contradictions, with the clean coherence of a shared account that was the same account because it was the truth. When the investigators packed their papers and stood to leave, Garrett paused at the front room door. Mr. Thompson. He looked at Jacob directly. There are 2 other ranchers in this territory who received similar approaches from Caldwell's operation. One of them sold. He believed the financial trouble was real. A pause. When this investigation concludes, I expect the outcome will allow him to revisit that transaction. Your documentation is going to matter to him, not just to you. Jacob was quiet for a moment. Then I'm glad we kept everything, he said. Garrett nodded. Miss Miller, the sworn statement you filed with Henderson, you'll need to make yourself available to testify if this proceeds to a formal hearing. I'll be here. Garrett looked at her steadily. You're certain? She looked back at him steadily. I'm certain. The investigators left. Donnie appeared approximately 30 seconds later from the direction of the barn. He had an extraordinary ability to materialize at moments of significance, which Caroline had decided was not accidental. How'd it go? His eyes were wide. It went well. Jacob was already at the window watching the investigators ride out. Go tell Pete. Donnie went, his footsteps accelerating toward the barn with the unmistakable energy of a man with very good news. Jacob turned from the window. He looked at Caroline with an expression that had exhaustion in it, and relief in it, and something larger than both. It's moving now, he said. Yes. It's out of our hands. The legal part is, the ranch isn't. She picked up her notes from the desk. Your September payroll is 3 days behind where it should be, and your supply order for winter feed needs to go to town by Friday, or you'll be short by January. He stared at her. Then he laughed. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh, a real laugh. Not the almost smile she'd caught a glimpse of twice, but an actual laugh, sudden and genuine and slightly startled, like something that had surprised itself by arriving. She looked at him laughing and felt something move through her chest that was warm and immediate and had no interest whatsoever in being managed. The payroll, he said. The payroll. She was smiling. She couldn't help it. And the feed order, and the east fence section that Pete mentioned, needs 3 new posts before the first hard freeze. You have a list. I always have a list. He crossed the room to her, stopped close enough that she had to look up slightly to hold his eyes. He reached out and tucked one strand of dark hair back from her face with the same simple directness. He'd reached for her hand on the boardwalk in Mill Haven, not performative, not careful, just the gesture of a man who had decided to stop managing the distance between himself and the things he wanted. October, he said quietly. What about it? I want to get married in October, before winter. There's a minister in Harlan Creek, Reverend Marsh. He's a decent man. He paused. Unless you want, October is fine. She looked up at him. October is good. He nodded. His hand came to rest lightly at her jaw, just for a moment. Ruth Hadley is going to have opinions, he said. Ruth Hadley is going to be thrilled. She's going to be loud about it. She's going to be loudly thrilled. There's a difference. He looked at her with that expression, the open one, the unguarded one, and she thought again, there he is. There's the man he'd sealed up in the fort and told himself didn't need anyone. He'd needed someone who wouldn't be put off by the fort. She'd walked up to the fort and waited and knocked again and looked at the gate hinge and noticed the cattle and stayed through the storm. And here they were, Jacob. She put her hand against his chest, felt his heartbeat steady and strong. The payroll. He closed his eyes briefly. The payroll. And the feed order. And the feed order. He stepped back, but slowly, the reluctance of it honest and unhidden. And the east fence. Pete's already been patient about the east fence. He shook his head. He was still almost smiling, which she had decided was better than most people's full smiles. You've been here 3 weeks, and you've completely reorganized my operation. Someone had to. She sat back down at the desk and picked up her pen. Sit down. I'll walk you through the payroll, and you can tell me if I've missed anything. He sat down across from her, and they worked, the two of them, at the desk in the front room of a house that was becoming, by steady daily increments, a house that felt like a home. While outside, the Montana afternoon moved toward evening, and the ranch settled into its rhythms, and Donnie's voice carried from the bunkhouse with the particular volume of a young man sharing news he considered significant. An hour in, without looking up from the ledger, Jacob said, "I'm going to tell Donnie." He already knows. A pause. How? Because he's Donnie. She turned a page. He knew before we did. Jacob was quiet for a moment. He said you were worth staying for, Jacob said. That first morning, when I asked him what he thought of you. She looked up. Donnie said that word for word. She looked back down at the ledger. Smart boy, she said. The smartest person on this ranch, Jacob said. Don't tell Pete. She bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling, and turned another page, and Jacob Thompson sat across from her and watched her work with the particular quality of attention he gave to things he was going to spend the rest of his life being grateful for. Outside, the dog barked once, short, satisfied, and then went quiet. The ranch was whole, and the man inside it was not alone anymore. A fact that settled over the Diamond T Ranch, not like something sudden, but like a season changing. The way warmth comes back to ground that has been frozen long enough that you'd almost stopped expecting it. The wedding was on a Saturday in the 3rd week of October. Ruth Hadley had, as predicted, been loudly thrilled. She had also, without being asked, organized the majority of it, which Caroline had not objected to, partly because Ruth Hadley was a woman who organized things the way rivers ran downhill, and partly because having someone else manage the details freed Caroline to manage the things that actually required her specific attention, which in the week before the wedding included the winter feed delivery, a discrepancy in the October payroll she wanted to resolve before she handed the books to Jacob to review, and a letter to Henderson confirming her availability for the federal hearing that had been scheduled for the following month. She was still working at the desk at 10 o'clock the night before the wedding when Jacob came downstairs. He stood in the doorway of the front room and looked at her. You're doing accounts. The October payroll had a transposition error in Pete's overtime column. It's been bothering me. The night before our wedding. It was bothering me. She corrected the entry, set down the pen. There, done. She looked up at him. What are you doing up? He crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her, the chair that had become over the last 4 weeks. Specifically his chair. The way things in a shared life gradually become specific without anyone deciding they should. He looked at the desk, the organized records, the lamp between them. I keep thinking about something, he said. Tell me. The night you arrived, the storm. He paused. I told you to stay in the house. I remember. You looked at me and you said no. I remember that too. He was quiet for a moment. I'd told 3 women before you over 4 years that this was a hard life, and I wasn't an easy man, and if they couldn't handle that, they should leave. And all 3 of them left. And I told myself that was fine, that it proved I was right about the kind of man I was. He paused. It never occurred to me that what I was actually doing was testing people with a test I'd designed them to fail. She looked at him across the lamp. You didn't design me to fail. No. His voice was quiet. You didn't let me. She reached across the desk and put her hand on his. Jacob, what you did for the past 4 years building those walls, running that test, that was a man protecting himself the only way he knew how. That's not a character flaw. That's a wound behaving like a wound. She held his gaze. It stopped working when I showed up because I wasn't playing the role your test was written for. I wasn't someone you needed to protect yourself from. He turned his hand over under hers. No. You were the opposite. Yes. He looked at their hands on the desk. I'm going to spend a long time making sure you know that. You've already started. She squeezed his hand. Go to sleep. Ruth Hadley is going to be at our door at 7 in the morning, and you need to be capable of full sentences. He almost smiled. Is she? She told me specifically. 7 o'clock. She has opinions about your coat. He stood. Looked at her for a moment, with the open expression, the one that still arrived on his face, sometimes with the slight surprise of a man not yet fully accustomed to the fact that he didn't have to seal it back up. Caroline. Go to sleep, Jacob. He went. She sat at the desk for another few minutes, not working, just sitting in the quiet of the house with the lamp burning and the October night pressing at the windows, and she thought about what she'd told him, that what he'd done was a wound behaving like a wound. And she thought about her own wounds, the ones she'd been carrying from St. Louis, and before the ones that had made running feel safer than staying for longer than she liked to admit. She'd stopped running in Billings, sitting on the edge of that narrow bed. She'd started staying here the night she told a man no, and walked out into a storm. She turned down the lamp and went upstairs. The wedding was small. The church in Harlan Creek held 30 people comfortably, and held 42 that Saturday morning, because the word had gone around, and the word in a small Montana town in 1886 was not a thing you could contain once Ruth Hadley was involved in its distribution. Reverend Marsh was a tall, thin man with a surprisingly warm voice, who had known Jacob since Jacob was a boy, and who looked at Caroline during the ceremony, with the expression of a man witnessing something he'd been hoping to witness for a considerable time and had started to suspect he wouldn't get to. Donnie cried. He tried to hide it behind a very unconvincing cough that fooled nobody, and that Pete ignored with the dignity of a man who understood that some things were better left unremarked. Ruth Hadley did not cry. She watched the whole proceeding with the alert, satisfied expression of someone whose project has come in exactly on specifications. Jacob kept his eyes on Caroline through the entire ceremony, not nervously, not with the distracted quality of a man managing his own emotions, just directly, steadily, the way he looked at everything he looked at carefully. She held his gaze and said the words clearly, and when Reverend Marsh pronounced them, married, Jacob took both her hands and held them for a moment before he kissed her, and his hands were completely steady, which she noticed, and which told her everything about where he'd arrived. Afterward, outside the church in the clear October cold, Ruth Hadley embraced her with the enthusiastic certainty of a woman who has been right about something and is not going to pretend otherwise. I knew, Ruth said directly into her ear. The moment Earl drove you out to that ranch, I knew you were different. You told me not to expect much, Caroline said. Ruth pulled back and looked at her with bright, frank eyes. I told you the truth. I didn't tell you to run from it. She patted her cheek once firmly, the way you'd pat the side of a horse you were pleased with. Good girl. Donnie shook Jacob's hand and then appeared to reconsider and clapped him on the shoulder instead, which produced an expression on Jacob's face that was approximately equal parts surprise and genuine warmth. You deserve this, Donnie said with the directness of a 22-year-old who has not yet learned to say important things in less important ways. Both of you. You deserve all of it. Jacob looked at him for a moment. Thank you, Donnie. Pete nodded at Caroline from a distance, with the particular economy of a man who has expressed everything he intends to express and has nothing further to add. She nodded back. It was enough. The federal hearing was on a Thursday in November, 6 weeks after the wedding. They rode to Millhaven together in the buckboard, both of them in their better clothes, both of them quiet with the particular quality of quiet that precedes something consequential. Henderson met them at his office and walked them to the territorial courthouse, a 2-story building that smelled of old wood and official paper, and they sat in a waiting room for 40 minutes while proceedings involving other matters concluded. Jacob sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded and didn't speak. Caroline sat beside him with the documentation folder on her lap and went through the key figures one more time in her head, not because she didn't know them, She knew every number, every date, every cross-referenced entry in her sleep by now. But because the discipline of reviewing them was a way of staying focused, and focused was what this required. Henderson reappeared. "They're ready." The hearing room was not dramatic, smaller than Caroline had imagined, with a long table at the front and chairs for witnesses, and the two federal investigators from the land office, and a federal examiner named Cole, who had the compressed authority of a man who had heard many cases and had learned to economize his reactions. Cole reviewed the documentation in silence for 20 minutes before he spoke. "Miss Miller." He looked up. "Mrs. Thompson." She'd been correcting that quietly for 2 weeks. It still arrived with a small private warmth every time. "The ledger analysis you prepared walked me through the methodology." She did. Clearly in order without excess. Every falsified entry. Every corresponding receipt. The timeline of Walt Greer's employment against the timeline of the alterations. The pattern of the falsification. Its architectural quality. Its systematic targeting of the operating margin in the specific way designed to support a narrative of financial failure. Cole asked questions. She answered them. He asked follow-up questions. She answered those too. At one point, he set down the document he was reading and looked at her over it. "You found this in 12 days. I found the first indications in 12 days. The complete documentation took 3 weeks. You were employed as a household manager. I was employed to manage the accounts and household of the Diamond T Ranch. The accounts included what you're looking at." Cole looked at the documentation again. The 1882 water rights letter, found in a receipt box in the barn. Original correspondence from the property's legal counsel confirming the water rights claim was unrestricted. Directly contradicting the document Caldwell filed with the land office. The signature on the Caldwell document, forged. The same hand that signed the Eastern Boundary Lien. We identified both in the same visit to the Millhaven Registry. She paused. The registry clerk Albert Foss made a formal notation in the property record at our request. That notation is in your documentation. Cole nodded slowly. He turned to the land office investigators. Garrett nodded. "Mr. Thompson." Cole turned to Jacob. "The individual identified as Walt Greer, you terminated his employment in March." "Yes, on suspicion of financial irregularities." "On certainty of financial irregularities, I couldn't yet prove clearly enough to pursue legally." "And you now believe he was placed in your employment by Caldwell?" "I believe it's the only explanation consistent with what was found in my books and with the timing of Caldwell's subsequent approaches. 3 approaches total. 2 before we discovered the documentation. 1 after which my wife was present for." Cole looked at Caroline. "He presented his offer," she said. "Referenced the financial position of the ranch and the Eastern Boundary Lien as evidence of the ranch's precarious situation. We informed him that both had been documented as fraudulent. He left." "What was his demeanor?" She considered this honestly. "Controlled. He adjusted quickly. But he understood that the approach he'd prepared hadn't worked." A pause. "He said it wasn't over." "And has he made any subsequent contact?" "No direct contact. Our lawyer," she glanced at Henderson, "has advised us that Caldwell's political connections in Helena have been notably quiet since the investigation opened. Henderson believes that indicates Caldwell is aware of the scope of what's been filed." Cole made a note. Looked at the documentation again. The adjacent county cases, the pattern evidence. 2 additional properties with lien filings using the same documentary structure. One of those property owners sold to a Caldwell-affiliated entity in July, believing his financial position was unrecoverable. She looked at Cole directly. "His financial position was manufactured the same way ours was. The documentation we developed for the Diamond T is directly applicable to his case." The room was quiet. Cole set down his pen. He looked at Jacob. "Mr. Thompson, the individual who sold in July, Thomas Whitfield. Are you familiar with him?" Jacob was quiet for a moment. "We went to school together. His father and my father ran adjacent grazing sections for 15 years. Cole absorbed this. He lost a property that his family had held for 20 years. Yes. Based on fraudulent financial documentation. Yes. Cole looked at the papers in front of him. Something in his expression moved. Not sentimentality. He wasn't a sentimental man, but something that was the professional equivalent of moral weight landing in its proper place. The investigation will proceed, he said. You'll receive formal notification of the next steps within 30 days. It is my expectation. He said it carefully. The word expectation carrying its specific legal weight. That the scope will include both the Diamond T matters and the adjacent county filings. He looked at Caroline. Mrs. Thompson, the documentation you've compiled the complete package. I'll need certified copies filed with this office by end of week. You'll have them by Wednesday. Henderson made a quiet sound that might have been satisfaction. They walked out of the courthouse into the November air, and Jacob stopped on the steps and stood there and breathed. Whitfield, he said quietly. I know. He doesn't know yet. That it was manufactured. That he didn't have to sell. He'll know soon. She took his arm. Henderson will make sure of it. Jacob was quiet for a moment. We went fishing every summer until we were 15. His father taught me to read a river current. He paused. He sold in July, and I didn't know it had happened until the investigators mentioned his name. Because you were dealing with your own fight. I should have. He stopped. Jacob. She turned to look at him. You couldn't have known. You were fighting the same thing he was fighting from inside it. Now you're on the other side of it, and you have documentation that's going to help him. That's what you can do. That's what you're already doing. He looked at her. How do you do that? He said quietly. Do what? See the right thing to say. She looked back at him steadily. I look at things. He exhaled. The corner of his mouth moved. He put his hand over hers where it rested on his arm and held it there. Wednesday, he said. Certified copies. Wednesday. She started down the steps. And you're buying me dinner before we drive back. Am I? It's a 20-mile drive and it's November, and I just testified before a federal examiner. You were extraordinary. I know. She looked back at him over her shoulder. Dinner, Jacob. He came down the steps. Henderson knows a place, he offered. Of course he does. The certified copies went to the land office on Tuesday, one day early. Henderson sent word the following week that Caldwell had retained a lawyer in Helena, a development that Henderson described in his careful legal language as a man preparing a defense, which meant a man who understood that an offense was no longer available to him. Thomas Whitfield came to the Diamond T on a Wednesday afternoon in late November. He was a quiet man in his early 40s, weathered in the specific way of men who had worked land for a long time and then lost it, which was a different kind of weathering than the kind that came from working land you still owned. There was a particular quality to his stillness when he came into the front room and looked at the documentation spread on the desk. A still that was the opposite of Jacob's stillness. Not controlled strength, but the careful holding together of a man who had taken a significant blow and was still deciding whether he was going to stay on his feet. He read the ledger analysis. He read Henderson's summary. He read the land office investigators' preliminary findings. Then he set everything down and sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. It was manufactured, he said. Yes. Caroline kept her voice level and direct. Not soft. He didn't need soft. He needed true. The financial picture you were presented with, the figures that indicated your operation was failing, they were falsified using the same method that was used on Jacob's books. Your physical records, if you kept them, will likely show the same pattern. I burned my records. His voice was flat. In August. I thought there was no reason to keep them. I thought I was starting over somewhere else. Jacob, sitting across from him, said nothing for a moment. Then, Tom. Whitfield looked at him. The federal investigation doesn't need your records. It has mine, and the adjacent county filing, the pattern evidence. Henderson asserted, it doesn't require your specific records to establish what was done to you. Jacob paused. You didn't fail. You were failed. There's a difference. Whitfield looked at Jacob for a long moment. Something moved through his face, complicated and private, and not finished the expression of a man receiving information that was going to take considerable time to fully arrive at all the places it needed to reach. 22 years, Whitfield said quietly. I know. My father's name is on the original land claim. I know. And they just... He stopped, pressed his lips together. They just walked in and... Yes. Jacob's voice was steady and quiet. And it's not going to stand. Whitfield looked at him. Henderson believes the sale can be challenged, Caroline said. Given the fraudulent basis on which it was made, it won't be simple, it won't be quick, but the legal standing is there. She held his gaze. If you're willing to be part of the federal complaint. Whitfield was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said finally. The word came out hard and certain, the particular certainty of a man who has been patient long past the point. Patience was comfortable. Yes, I'm willing. The federal ruling came in February. Henderson sent word by Ryder he'd arranged this specifically knowing that a letter arriving in the regular post was not adequate to the occasion. The rider came at mid-morning on a Tuesday, and Caroline was in the kitchen, and Jacob was in the barn, and the rider had to wait 4 minutes while someone went to get him. Jacob came in with the envelope still sealed. He held it out to Caroline. She looked at it. Looked at him. Open it, she said. It's your ranch. It's our ranch. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she took the envelope and opened it and read it, and the thing that happened to her face made Jacob cross the kitchen in 3 steps. She handed him the letter. He read it. The Federal Land Office ruling found the eastern boundary lien fraudulent and ordered it voided. The 1882 water rights document was found to be a forgery and struck from the record. The Diamond T's water rights were confirmed unrestricted, consistent with the original 1882 land claim. Mountain Standard Holdings, which had been identified as a Caldwell-controlled entity, was ordered dissolved pending further criminal proceedings. Caldwell himself was named in a formal referral to the federal territorial prosecutor, and Thomas Whitfield's sale had been flagged for review under the fraud findings with a court-appointed examiner assigned to determine the appropriate remedy. Jacob finished reading. He set the letter on the kitchen table. He stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides and his face doing the thing it did when something had arrived that was larger than the words available for it. Then he turned to Caroline. She was already looking at him. Your father's ranch, she said. His jaw moved. Yes. Still yours. Yes. His voice was not entirely steady, which was the first time in the 4 months she'd known him that it hadn't been. He didn't try to correct it. Yes, still ours. She crossed to him and put both arms around him, and he held her with the full, unheld strength of a man who had spent 4 years not letting himself hold anyone, and was done with that, now completely and permanently done with it. They stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Then Donnie knocked on the back door. The rider came from town, is it, did it? Jacob lifted his head. Yes. A sound from outside the door that was Donnie at his most uncontained. Then Pete's voice quieter asking something. Then Donnie again louder. Caroline stepped back and picked up the letter. Go tell them, she said. Come with me. She looked at him. Come with me, he said again. Simple, direct. You built this too. Come out and stand there when I tell them. She put the letter in his hand and walked to the back door and opened it. Donnie was on the porch with the expression of a man whose entire emotional capacity was being fully utilized. Pete stood behind him with the particular expression of a man who was moved and intended to express that fact through the dignified medium of absolute stillness. Jacob came to stand beside her in the doorway. He told them. Donnie made a sound that was not a word in any language but communicated perfectly. Pete nodded once slowly, with the gravity of a man receiving confirmation of something he had always believed was true. And Ruth Hadley, who had apparently arrived sometime in the previous 10 minutes, in the way that Ruth Hadley arrived at things informed by some network of small-town knowledge that operated faster than any rider, came around the corner of the porch and looked at Jacob and Caroline standing together in the doorway and said, Well, it's about time. Then she embraced Caroline firmly and told Jacob he looked thin and asked whether there was coffee and swept into the kitchen without waiting for an answer to any of it. Years later, more years than the specific number, mattered people in Harlan Creek, and in Millhaven, and in the wider stretch of Montana Territory that had watched Caldwell work his patient frauds and seen them finally completely dismantled, remembered the Diamond T case, the way you remember a thing that changed the shape of what was possible. They remembered the federal ruling. They remembered Thomas Whitfield getting his land back. They remembered Caldwell's criminal referral and what followed from it, and the 2 other ranchers in adjacent counties who recovered properties they'd believed were gone. They remembered Jacob Thompson, who had stood in front of the federal examiner and named what had been done to him and his neighbors, with the plain, steady certainty of a man whose documentation was clean and whose position was solid. But what they remembered most, what Ruth Hadley told her grandchildren, and what Donnie told anyone who would listen for the rest of his long life, was the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach with a suitcase and $14, and 3 weeks later stood in front of Marcus Caldwell on a porch in Montana and dismantled everything he'd built against the Diamond T in the language of documented fact, clear and precise, and completely unafraid. Not because she'd had to be there, because she'd chosen to be. That was the thing that stuck. That was the thing people returned to when they told the story. Not the fraud, or the federal ruling, or the legal machinery that had ground Caldwell's operation to its end. The choice. The woman who had looked at a hard man in a hard life and decided he was worth staying for. Who had looked at a fight that wasn't hers yet and made it hers. Who had looked at a gate hinge and a second-hand ledger entry and an unsigned document in a bottom drawer and understood before anyone else did what they meant and what they required. Caroline Thompson. She'd been Caroline Miller once, but she was Caroline Thompson now, and the name sat on her. The way names sit on people who have arrived where they belong ran the Diamond T accounts for the next 31 years. She also, it turned out, had a head for operational management that extended well past the ledger books, and Jacob, who had spent 4 years being a man who needed no one, and had spent the following decades being a man who understood exactly how wrong he'd been, gave her full authority over the whole of it inside the first year, and never had cause to reconsider. Donnie got his own small spread, eventually 20 miles north, and ran it well, and came back to the Diamond T for branding season every year until he was too old to ride, at which point he came anyway, and stood at the fence, and supervised, and called it contribution. Pete stayed until he retired. He never elaborated on his feelings about any of it, but he stayed, and in a man like Pete, that was the same thing. Ruth Hadley visited every Sunday that the weather permitted and had opinions about the kitchen organization and the garden and the furniture arrangement, and once memorably, the placement of a new fence post on the west boundary, and Caroline listened to all of it with the same steady, clear attention she'd always given to things worth listening to. Jacob Thompson was still hard sometimes, still stubborn, still the kind of man who fell silent when something moved him, rather than reaching for words, who expressed things through the quality of his attention, rather than the ease of his speech, who took longer than most people to trust and held what he trusted with a permanence that most people couldn't match. How was still a cowboy, still a rancher, still the man who had built that fort around himself and called it self-sufficiency and meant it. But he was not alone. And on the mornings when the early light came through the east windows of that house and landed on the organized desk in the front room, the desk with the clean, accurate records and the letters from Henderson filed in their proper place, and the correspondence with Whitfield and the Federal Land Office, and all the paper evidence of a fight that had been won through patience and honesty, and the absolute refusal to leave Jacob Thompson, would stand in the doorway of that room and look at all of it and think about a woman stepping off a stagecoach with $14 and one suitcase, and about a storm, and about a barn, and about 3 words he'd said into the dark to see what would happen, and about the fact that she hadn't run. She had looked at the worst he had to offer, the walls, and the tests, and the cold, and the loneliness that had calcified into its own kind of armor, and she had stayed. Not because she had nowhere else to go, not because she had something to prove, but because she had looked at the man inside the fort and decided he was worth the door. That was the story people told, and every word of it was true.